Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Sarah Rodriguez, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Pine Mountain State Resort Park in southeastern Kentucky, near the border with Virginia. I was there with my college roommate Jennifer Williams and her boyfriend Michael Brown for what was supposed to be a 3-day hiking and camping trip to celebrate Jennifer's promotion at the marketing firm where we both worked. The drive from Louisville had taken us nearly 4 hours through increasingly winding mountain roads. By the time we reached the trailhead at Chained Rock, the sun was already beginning its descent behind the Cumberland Mountains. The parking area was empty except for a rusted pickup truck that looked like it hadn't moved in years. "Are you sure this is the right place?" Jennifer asked, checking her phone for the third time. No signal, as expected. The GPS had started glitching about 20 miles back, directing us in circles through tiny mountain towns with names like Thousand Sticks and Ages. Michael shouldered his oversized backpack, the kind of expensive gear he'd bought after watching too many survival shows. "This is it. Pine Mountain Trail. The guy at the outfitter shop in Pineville said it's one of the most isolated sections in the park, perfect for getting away from everything." That should have been our first warning. The trail began innocuously enough, a well-marked path through dense hardwood forest. October in eastern Kentucky painted the mountainsides in brilliant reds and golds, but here under the canopy, shadows came early. Our boots crunched through fallen leaves as we climbed steadily upward, following yellow blazes painted on oak and maple trees. Jennifer walked between Michael and me, chattering nervously about work gossip and weekend plans. She'd always been a talker when she was anxious, filling silence with whatever came to mind. It was one of the things that had driven our other roommates crazy back in college, but I'd grown to find it comforting. Normal. "Did you know this area was settled by coal miners in the 1800s? Michael said, reading from a guidebook he'd downloaded before we lost cell service. "There are abandoned mine shafts all through these mountains. Some of them go down hundreds of feet." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. I'd always had a thing about enclosed spaces, about being trapped underground. The thought of hidden shafts opening beneath our feet made my palms sweat despite the cooling air. "That's lovely," I muttered, quickening my pace. We hiked for 2 hours before finding what looked like a suitable campsite, a small clearing beside a creek about 50 yards off the main trail. The spot was sheltered by towering pines and rhododendron bushes, with a fire ring made from stacked stones that suggested others had camped here before. As we set up our tents, I noticed something odd about the fire ring. The stones were blackened, sure, but there was something else. Dark stains that looked too red to be rust, too organic to be minerals. When I knelt to examine them closer, the smell hit me, metallic and thick, like pennies left in water. "Guys!" I called out, but Jennifer was struggling with her tent poles and Michael had wandered off to collect firewood. I decided to leave it alone. Probably just old blood from cleaned fish or game. Mountain folks hunted these woods all the time. By the time we had camp set up, full darkness had fallen. The temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees, and our breath came out in small puffs. Michael got a fire going with more effort than his survival show knowledge had prepared him for, cursing as he blew on smoking tinder. "This wood is weird," he said, holding up a piece of split oak. "It's bone dry, but burns like it's green. And look at the flames." He was right. The fire burned with an odd blue-green tinge around the edges, and it gave off almost no heat despite the height of the flames. We huddled closer anyway, more for the psychological comfort than warmth. That's when we heard the first whisper. It came from the darkness beyond our circle of firelight, soft and sibilant like wind through leaves. Except there was no wind. The forest had gone completely still, not even the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. "Did you hear that?" Jennifer asked, her constant chatter finally faltering. We all sat perfectly still, listening. Nothing. "Just the wind," Michael said, but his voice lacked conviction. I pulled my sleeping bag tighter around my shoulders. The whisper had sounded almost like words, like someone calling from very far away, or very close and speaking very quietly. We tried to make normal camping conversation after that. Ghost stories, memories from college, plans for Jennifer's new position. But every few minutes one of us would stop mid-sentence, head tilted, listening for something that wasn't quite there. Around midnight, Michael volunteered to bank the fire for the night. Jennifer had already retreated to the tent we were sharing, and I was gathering my toiletries for a quick trip to the creek to brush my teeth. "Don't go alone," Michael said, his earlier bravado replaced by genuine concern. "Use the buddy system." But Jennifer was already zipped up in her sleeping bag, and I really needed to pee. "I'll just be 5 minutes. Stay by the fire where I can see the light." The creek ran cold and clear over smooth stones. I did my business quickly and was rinsing my hands when I saw the reflection. At first, I thought it was my own face looking back at me from the dark water, but the reflection was smiling, and I wasn't. The reflection tilted its head at an angle that made my neck ache just watching. When I jerked backward, the thing in the water continued to stare up at me for several seconds before slowly dissolving into ripples. I ran back to camp, heart hammering against my ribs. "What's wrong?" Michael asked, looking up from where he was spreading dirt over the coals. "Nothing," I said quickly, "just spooked myself." But I couldn't shake the image of that face. My face, but wrong somehow. The eyes had been too wide, the smile too knowing. And there had been something in the background of the reflection, a shape that definitely hadn't been behind me. I lay awake in the tent listening to Jennifer's steady breathing and the small sounds of the forest settling for the night. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me tense. But gradually, exhaustion won out over fear, and I drifted into uneasy sleep. I woke to Jennifer shaking me roughly. "Sarah, wake up. Something's wrong with Michael." Gray dawn light filtered through the tent walls. I could hear Michael outside, but something was off about the sounds he was making. Not quite words, more like humming or singing, but with no discernible melody. I unzipped the tent flap and looked out. Michael sat by the dead fire, his back to us, rocking slightly back and forth. The sound was coming from him, a low, droning vocalization that seemed to have no pattern or purpose. "Michael," Jennifer called softly, "are you okay?" He stopped rocking and slowly turned toward us. His face was completely blank, eyes unfocused and staring. When he smiled, it was the same too wide smile I'd seen in the creek reflection. "I'm fine," he said, but his voice was flat, mechanical. "Just watching the sunrise." There was no sunrise. The sky was overcast, gray, and oppressive. Jennifer emerged from the tent and walked toward him. "You're scaring us. What were you singing?" "Singing?" Michael's head tilted at that unnatural angle. "I wasn't singing. I was listening." "Listening to what?" "The voices. They've been calling all night. Don't you hear them?" I heard them now. Whispers coming from every direction, just at the edge of comprehension. They seemed to be coming from the trees themselves, from the rocks, from the very air around us. "Michael," I said carefully, "when did you get up?" "I never went to sleep." His smile widened. "They told me not to. They said sleep makes you vulnerable. They said they've been waiting for someone like us to come here." Jennifer backed away slowly, her face pale. "Someone like us? Outsiders? People no one will miss right away." That's when I noticed his hands. The fingernails were caked with dirt and something darker. Dried blood formed crescents under each nail as if he'd been clawing at something. Or someone. "Michael, show me your hands," I said. He looked down at them with mild curiosity, as if seeing them for the first time. "They're dirty. I was digging." "Digging what?" "A place to put things. They showed me where." The whispers were getting louder now, more insistent. I could almost make out words. Old words in a language that predated English but somehow felt familiar. The sound made my teeth ache and my vision blur around the edges. "We need to leave," I told Jennifer. "Right now." But when I turned to start packing our gear, Michael was suddenly behind me, closer than anyone should have been able to move that quietly. "You can't leave," he said, still smiling that horrible smile. "They won't let you. They've been so lonely." His hand shot out and grabbed my wrist. His skin was ice cold and his grip was stronger than Michael had ever been. Much stronger. "Jennifer, run!" I shouted, trying to break free. But Jennifer was staring past both of us, her mouth open in a soundless scream. I followed her gaze and saw them. They emerged from the tree line like smoke given form, tall, thin figures that seemed to bend and shift as they moved. Their faces were obscured by shadow, but I could see their eyes, pale and luminous in the gray morning light. There were at least a dozen of them, surrounding our campsite in a loose circle. The whispers had become a chorus now, no longer trying to disguise themselves as wind or imagination. They spoke in unison, their voices layering over each other in harmonies that human throats were never meant to make. "Welcome, children. We have been waiting so long for visitors." Michael's grip tightened on my wrist until I could feel bones grinding together. "They're hungry," he said conversationally. "They've been hungry for such a long time." I yanked backward with all my strength and managed to break free, stumbling and falling hard on the rocky ground. Jennifer grabbed my arm and hauled me to my feet. "The trail," she gasped. "We have to get back to the trail." We ran, crashing through the underbrush toward where we thought the main path should be. Behind us, I could hear Michael laughing. Not his laugh, but something using his voice. The shadow figures flowed through the trees alongside us, keeping pace effortlessly. But when we reached where the trail should have been, there was nothing. No path, no yellow blazes, just more endless forest stretching in every direction. "This is impossible," Jennifer panted. "We marked the way. We left the campsite right here." I spun in a circle, trying to find any landmark I recognized. The trees all looked the same now, towering, ancient things with bark that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at it. The whispers followed us, coming from everywhere and nowhere. "Time works differently here," Michael's voice called from somewhere behind us. He sounded farther away now, but the acoustics of the forest made it impossible to tell which direction. They showed me. Past and present, they're all the same. The miners who disappeared in 1847, the hunting party that vanished in 1923, the family that got lost in 1965. They're all still here, still listening to the voices. Jennifer grabbed my hand, her fingers trembling. "We have to find high ground." "Get our bearings." We pushed through a thicket of mountain laurel and started climbing upward, following what looked like a deer path. The whispers followed us, sometimes fading to nothing, sometimes swelling to a volume that made my ears ring. After what felt like hours but could have been minutes, time seemed elastic here. Stretching and contracting without reason, we reached a rocky outcrop that gave us a view of the surrounding forest. What we saw made no sense. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, but it was wrong. Roads and clearings that should have been visible were gone. In the distance, I could see the skeletal remains of what looked like mining equipment, structures that historical records said had been dismantled decades ago. "Sarah," Jennifer whispered, "look at the sun." I looked up. There were 2 suns in the sky, pale and weak, casting everything in a sickly double shadow. As I watched, they seemed to pulse in rhythm with the whispers that surrounded us. "We're not in Kentucky anymore," I said. "Or we're not in our Kentucky." A scream echoed from somewhere below us, high and desperate and definitely human. Then it cut off abruptly, leaving only the eternal whispers. "Michael," Jennifer breathed. We found him 20 minutes later in a clearing we definitely hadn't seen before. He was hanging upside down from an oak tree, suspended by ropes made from twisted vines. His eyes were open but rolled back, showing only white. Blood trickled from his mouth and nose, but he was still breathing. still whispering along with the voices that filled the air. The shadow figures stood in a circle around him, and now I could see their faces clearly. They had once been human, men, women, even children, but something had hollowed them out, leaving only skin stretched over empty space. Their mouths moved in unison with the whispers, and I realized they were the source. "He's becoming one of them," Jennifer said, her voice barely audible. As we watched, Michael's skin began to change, becoming translucent, then transparent. I could see the tree trunk behind him through his torso. His whispers grew louder, joining the chorus that seemed to vibrate in my bones. "The process takes time," said a voice behind us. We spun around to find a woman stepping out from behind a boulder. She looked normal at first glance, middle-aged, wearing hiking clothes that might have been fashionable 20 years ago. But her eyes were the same pale, luminous color as the shadow figures. "I'm Martha," she said pleasantly. "I've been here since 1987. Got separated from my husband during a day hike. Found this place by accident." She gestured to the clearing. "It's not so bad once you accept it. The hunger fades after a while." "What do you want?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Company, mostly. It gets lonely being the only solid one. The others, they're more like echoes now. Impressions left behind. But newcomers, like your friend, they maintain some substance for a few days. It's nice to have someone to talk to." Jennifer stepped closer to me. "What happened to everyone else? The people who disappeared?" Martha's smile was sad but genuine. "They're all here in one form or another. This place collects things. People, time, memories. It's like a pocket turned inside out. Everything that falls in stays in." "There has to be a way out," I said. "Oh, there is, but it requires a trade." My stomach dropped. "What kind of trade?" "One stays, one goes. The place needs to maintain balance. It's willing to let one of you return to your world, but someone has to take their place in the collection." I looked at Michael hanging from the tree, his transformation already halfway complete. "What about him?" "He's already chosen, made his deal with the Whispers last night while you were sleeping. They offered him knowledge, showed him how the world really works, all the hidden connections. In exchange, he agreed to stay and add his voice to theirs." The whispers suddenly intensified, and I could finally make out words in English mixed in with the older language. "Stay with us, stay forever, stay and listen, stay and learn the secrets between the seconds, the truth behind the trees, the names of things that have no names." "You can't seriously be considering this," Jennifer said, reading my expression. But I was, because the alternative was both of us joining Michael in his transformation, becoming hollow echoes that would whisper to the next group of hikers who wandered off the trail. "How do we know you're telling the truth?" I asked Martha. "How do we know the one who leaves actually makes it out?" Martha reached into her jacket and pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Local man returns after week-long disappearance." Below was a photo of a middle-aged man who looked shell-shocked but very much alive. "That's my husband, Tom. I made the trade for him in 1987. He made it home. Told everyone I'd fallen down a mine shaft, that he'd searched for days but never found my body." She tucked the clipping away. "He remarried eventually. Had the life we'd planned. It was worth it." "Sarah, no," Jennifer said, grabbing my arm. "We'll find another way. We'll figure something out." But even as she spoke, I could see the shadow figures closing in around us. The whispers were getting inside my head now, showing me things. Glimpses of the vast network of connected places like this one, pockets of wrongness scattered across the world where the normal rules didn't apply. I saw the miners from 1847, still working their impossible shifts in tunnels that existed between dimensions. I saw the hunting party from 1923, forever tracking prey that stayed just out of sight. I saw families and hikers and lovers, all caught in this place's web of wrongness. And I saw what would happen if neither of us chose. We would join them all, become part of the whisper chorus that lured others into the trap. Our voices would join the eternal calling that had drawn us here in the first place. "I'll stay," I said quietly. "Sarah, no." "I'll stay," I said louder, addressing Martha and the shadow figures. "Let Jennifer go home. Let her have the life she's supposed to have." The whispers suddenly stopped. The silence was so complete it felt like pressure against my eardrums. Even the wind ceased, leaving the forest in perfect, unnatural stillness. Martha nodded sadly. "The trade is witnessed and accepted. Jennifer Williams, you are free to leave. Follow the path that will appear and don't look back, no matter what you hear." A trail materialized behind Jennifer, glowing faintly in the gray light. It led downhill toward what looked like normal forest, trees that stayed the same shape when I blinked, shadows that fell in single patterns. Jennifer was crying now, tears streaming down her face. "I can't leave you here. I won't." "You have to," I said, pushing her gently toward the path. "One of us has to make it back. One of us has to remember this place exists, warn people away from it. But Sarah, go, now, before I change my mind." She hugged me fiercely, then turned and ran down the glowing path. I watched until she disappeared into the normal trees, and then the path faded away like it had never existed. The whispers resumed, softer now, almost welcoming. "It's time," Martha said. "The change isn't painful, more like letting go." I felt the wrongness beginning to seep into me, starting at my fingers and toes and working inward. My vision began to shift, showing me the forest as it really was. Not just trees and rocks, but a living network of connections stretching across space and time. I could see the other places like this one, the thin spots where reality wore through. But something was fighting the change, a burning sensation in my chest that grew stronger instead of weaker. I looked down and saw that my hiking jacket was smoldering, a small circle of fabric beginning to char. My grandmother's rosary. I'd forgotten about it, tucked away in my inner pocket. The metal was growing hot against my skin, hot enough to burn. "Interesting," Martha said, tilting her head. "It's been a long time since we've had one with protection." The shadow figures were backing away now, their whispers becoming agitated, discordant. The two suns overhead flickered like dying bulbs. "What's happening?" I asked. "Faith," Martha said simply. "Real faith, carried close to the heart. It's one of the few things that can disrupt the process. Your grandmother must have been a very devout woman." She had been. Lit candles for family members, said the rosary every night, attended Mass even when she was too sick to walk unassisted. She'd pressed the beads into my hand the day before she died, telling me they'd keep me safe from the hungry dark. I pulled the rosary from my pocket. The silver crucifix was glowing with its own light, and the beads were almost too hot to touch. The whispers turned to shrieks, and several of the shadow figures began to dissolve entirely. "You have a choice now," Martha said, and for the first time since I'd met her, she sounded uncertain. "The protection won't last forever, but it might be enough to get you out. If you leave now, immediately, you might make it back to your world." "What about the trade? What about balance?" "The place is upset. It doesn't like being denied what it was promised, but sometimes faith can override darker contracts." Michael was screaming now, his half-transformed body writhing against the vines that held him. The whispers were becoming chaotic, overlapping voices arguing in languages I couldn't understand. "If I go, what happens to him?" Martha's expression was grim. "He made his choice freely. No protection, no faith, no resistance. He belongs to them now." The rosary was burning my palm, but I held on tight. A new path was forming, different from the one Jennifer had taken, rougher, steeper, lined with thorns and jagged rocks. It led up instead of down, toward a light that hurt to look at directly. "The path of pain," Martha said. It will cost you blood, exhaustion, maybe pieces of your sanity, but it leads home. I took a step toward the painful path, then stopped. Come with me. Martha shook her head. I made my trade 37 years ago. I can't leave now even if I wanted to. But you still have a chance. The shadow figures were reforming, gathering courage as the rosary's light began to dim. Time was running out. I ran. The path was everything Martha had promised and worse. Thorns shredded my clothes and skin. Rocks cut through my hiking boots. The slope was so steep I had to use my hands to climb, leaving bloody prints on stone that felt organic, alive. Behind me, the whispers rose to a crescendo of rage and hunger. I could feel them reaching for me, cold fingers brushing the back of my neck. But the rosary's heat kept them at bay, barely. I climbed for what felt like hours, maybe days. The double suns wheeled overhead in impossible patterns. My water ran out. My legs cramped and my lungs burned, but I kept climbing because stopping meant falling back into their grasp. Finally, impossibly, I reached the top. On the other side of the ridge was normal forest, real trees with single shadows, a single sun in a properly blue sky, and in the distance, the sound of traffic on a highway. I stumbled down the far slope and emerged onto Route 421, about 5 miles from where we'd parked the car. A trucker stopped for me, took one look at my bloody, torn condition, and drove me straight to the hospital in Pineville. The police found our abandoned car at the Chained Rock trailhead. They searched for Michael and Jennifer for 3 days but found no trace of either of them. The official report listed them as missing, presumed dead due to exposure or accident in the remote wilderness. But I knew better. Michael was still there, transformed into something that whispered to lost hikers. And Jennifer. I had to believe she'd made it home. Had to believe that at least one of us had earned a normal life. The rosary had crumbled to dust by the time I reached the hospital. My grandmother's protection had been used up, spent to buy my freedom from a place where time ran backward and hunger wore human faces. I never went hiking again, never went camping. I moved to the city, got a job in an office building where I could see traffic and people and all the blessed normalcy of human civilization. But sometimes, late at night when the wind is just right, I hear them calling. The whispers carry farther than you'd think, reaching across the miles to remind me that some trades can never be fully completed, that some hungers are never satisfied. They're still there, in that pocket of wrongness hidden in the Kentucky mountains. Still waiting for the next group of hikers to wander off the trail, to hear voices in the wind and follow them into the trees, still whispering my name. My name is David Jones, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote hollows near Pine Mountain State Resort Park, deep in the Appalachian wilderness of Kentucky, where the ancient ridges swallow sound and the forest holds secrets older than memory. I should have listened to Marcus when he said we were going too deep into the backcountry. Should have turned back when our GPS started giving us impossible readings. Should have paid attention to the way the locals in Pineville looked at us when we mentioned heading into Chained Rock territory during the new moon. But I was running from something back home. A divorce that had gutted me. A job that felt like slow death. A life that had become nothing but hollow routine. The wilderness promised silence, and silence was all I craved. Marcus Chen had been my college roommate, the kind of friend who shows up when your world collapses without asking questions. When I called him at 2 a.m. 3 weeks after Rachel left, sobbing into the phone about how empty everything felt, he just said, "Pack your gear, I know a place." Marcus worked as a software engineer in Louisville but spent every weekend hiking Kentucky's most remote trails. He knew the wilderness like others knew city streets. Sarah Thompson was Marcus's girlfriend of 2 years, a trauma nurse from Lexington General with steady hands and kind eyes. She'd joined us on hikes before, always carrying a medical kit that seemed absurdly comprehensive until you realized she'd seen what the mountains could do to the unprepared. She had a quiet strength that made me understand why Marcus had fallen for her so completely. We'd been planning this trip for months, 5 days deep in the Cumberland Gap region, following old logging roads and game trails into areas where cell towers were distant dreams. The plan was simple. Hike into the hollow between Pine Mountain and Log Mountain, establish a base camp near the headwaters of Stinking Creek, and spend our days exploring the limestone caves and forgotten mining shafts that dotted the landscape like wounds in the earth. The first sign something was wrong came as we were loading our packs at the trailhead near Chained Rock. My phone, which had been working perfectly during the drive from Louisville, suddenly showed no signal despite being in an area where I'd had coverage before. Marcus checked his GPS unit, a military-grade device he'd invested in after getting lost on Cumberland Ridge 2 summers prior, and frowned at the screen. "That's weird," he muttered, tapping the display. "It's showing our coordinates as somewhere in Virginia." Sarah pulled out her backup compass, the old brass one her grandfather had carried in Korea. The needle spun lazily for a moment before settling on what should have been magnetic north, but something felt off about the direction it indicated. The shadows seemed wrong for the afternoon sun. "Equipment failure," I said, wanting to believe it. "Electronics hate humidity." But Marcus was already recalibrating, running diagnostics that should have fixed any simple glitch. The GPS continued insisting we were 40 miles from where we knew we were standing. We decided to rely on paper maps and the compass, figuring we could navigate by landmark and terrain like hikers had done for generations. The trail into the hollow started normally enough, a well-maintained path through second-growth forest marked with the familiar white blazes of the Kentucky trail system. But after the first mile, the blazes became sporadic, then absent entirely. The path itself seemed to shift subtly when we weren't looking directly at it, like peripheral vision playing tricks. Trees I was certain we'd passed appeared again, unchanged, as if we were walking in circles despite the compass showing steady progress southwest into the valley. "David, look at this," Sarah called out, kneeling beside a massive oak tree. Carved into the bark were symbols I didn't recognize, not initials or dates, but something older, deeper. The cuts had healed strangely, forming keloid-like ridges that made the marks appear to writhe in the shifting light. Marcus examined the carvings with the focused intensity he brought to debugging code. "These aren't recent," he said. "Look at the scar tissue formation. These were cut decades ago, maybe longer." As we continued deeper, more trees bore similar markings. Always on the north-facing side, always at eye level, always in clusters of 7 symbols arranged in patterns that seemed almost linguistic. The forest grew quieter as we descended, the normal sounds of birds and insects fading until our footsteps and breathing became unnaturally loud. By late afternoon, we reached what appeared to be our intended campsite, a clearing beside a narrow creek that matched the description on our topographical map. But something felt wrong about the space. The grass grew in strange patterns, forming rough circles where nothing would take root. The creek ran clear but carried an odd metallic smell, like old pennies left in water. "Temperature's dropping fast," Sarah observed, checking her thermometer. 40 degrees in the last hour. That was impossible. Weather reports had called for mild October temperatures, and the afternoon had been pleasantly warm, but I could feel it too, a bone-deep chill that seemed to radiate from the ground itself. We made camp quickly, setting up our tents in a triangle formation as Marcus always insisted for safety. The familiar routine of organizing gear and preparing dinner helped normalize the strangeness, but the feeling of being watched never left. Eyes in the tree line, patient and calculating. Night fell faster than it should have. One moment we were sitting around our campfire sharing stories and passing Marcus's flask of bourbon. The next, we were surrounded by absolute darkness, despite my watch showing only 7:30 p.m. The fire, which had been burning cheerfully on seasoned hardwood, began to struggle. The flames turned an odd greenish color and gave off little heat despite consuming fuel normally. "Wind must be changing," Marcus said. but there was no wind. The air hung motionless and heavy, pressing against us like a physical weight. Sarah tried to restart the fire with fresh kindling, but the flames continued their sickly green dance. The light they cast seemed to stop at an invisible barrier about 6 feet from the fire ring, as if the darkness beyond was too thick to penetrate. That's when we heard the first sound from the forest. A long, low call that might have been an owl if owls screamed like dying children. The sound came from directly above us. Impossible unless something was perched in the canopy 60 feet overhead. "Great horned owl," I said, though I didn't believe it. The call came again, closer, followed by answering cries from 3 different directions. We were surrounded. Marcus stood and walked to the edge of our circle of firelight, peering into the darkness. "I can't see anything," he said, but his voice carried an edge I'd never heard before. Marcus was unflappable, the kind of person who stayed calm during crisis. Hearing uncertainty in his voice made my stomach clench. The calls continued intermittently throughout the evening, sometimes close enough that branches rustled overhead, sometimes distant enough to be mere echoes. But they maintained a pattern, a rhythm like conversation. When one voice called, others would answer in sequence, creating a spiral of sound that seemed to tighten around our camp. Sleep was impossible. I lay in my tent listening to Sarah and Marcus whisper nervously in theirs, to the continued calling from the forest, and to something else. A rhythmic scratching that seemed to come from directly beneath my sleeping bag. When I pressed my ear to the ground, I could swear I heard movement in the earth itself, as if something were tunneling just below the surface. At 3:17 a.m. according to my watch, the sounds stopped. Complete silence fell over the hollow like a blanket, so absolute that I could hear my own pulse thundering in my ears. The silence was worse than the noise had been. It felt expectant, pregnant with potential violence. Morning brought no relief. The sun rose, but its light seemed filtered and weak, giving everything a gray, washed-out appearance. Our fire had died sometime during the night despite being banked with coals that should have lasted until dawn. Stranger still, the ashes were cold. Not just cool, but actually cold to the touch, as if they'd been extinguished with ice water. "Did anyone else notice our food?" Sarah asked, holding up what remained of our dried goods. Everything had gone rancid overnight. Beef jerky that had been fresh when we made camp now crawled with maggots. Trail mix had turned to black mush that smelled like grave dirt. Even our sealed water bottles tasted of sulfur and decay. We had emergency rations, MREs that Marcus had acquired from his brother in the army, but the sight of our spoiled food triggered a deep unease. Food doesn't rot that fast under any normal circumstances. "We should head back," Sarah said, and I could see she was fighting to keep her voice steady. "Something's not right here." But when we consulted our compass and map, north, the direction back to the trailhead, led directly into a cliff face that hadn't been there the day before. According to our topographical map, we were standing in the middle of a valley, but the terrain around us showed steep ridges on all sides forming a bowl with no visible exit. "GPS is still showing Virginia," Marcus reported, his usual calm cracking slightly. "And look at this." He showed us the screen which displayed our location as shifting rapidly, jumping miles at a time despite us standing perfectly still. We spent 2 hours exploring the perimeter of the hollow, looking for the trail we'd followed in. It was gone. Not overgrown, not blocked, simply absent, as if it had never existed. The symbols carved into the trees seemed more prominent in daylight, and I noticed something that made my blood run cold. They were carved on trees in a perfect circle around our campsite. "We're trapped," I said, the words feeling strange in my mouth. "There has to be an explanation," Marcus insisted, but even he was starting to look shaken. "Geographic anomaly, maybe. Fog affecting our perception." But there was no fog, and the impossible geography remained stubbornly real. The hollow had become a trap, and we were caught in its center like flies in amber. That afternoon, while Sarah reorganized our remaining food and I attempted to get any kind of signal on our devices, Marcus volunteered to explore the caves we'd spotted on the eastern slope of the hollow. "Maybe there's another way out," he said. "Cave systems sometimes connect to surface openings miles away." I should have gone with him, should have insisted we stay together, but I was focused on our survival situation, calculating water rations and food supplies, trying to determine how long we could last before rescue became necessary. Marcus had always been the most capable of us in wilderness situations. If anyone could find an alternate route, it would be him. He left at 2 p.m. with his headlamp, rope, and a promise to be back by sunset. Sarah and I spent the afternoon trying to make sense of our situation, creating signal fires, attempting to climb the surrounding ridges only to find them impossibly steep and crumbling under our weight. Sunset came and went. Marcus didn't return. By 10 p.m., Sarah was pacing around our fire like a caged animal. "We have to go look for him," she said for the dozenth time. "In the dark? In caves we don't know?" I shook my head. He could be anywhere in that system. We'd just get lost ourselves. But even as I spoke, I knew we couldn't just wait. Marcus was careful, experienced. He wouldn't stay out past dark unless something was seriously wrong. The decision was made for us when we heard his voice calling from the forest. "David, Sarah, I found something." Relief flooded through me. "Marcus," I called back. "Where are you?" "Follow my voice," came the reply, but something was off about it. The tone was right, the words were right, but there was a flatness to the delivery that made me hesitate. Sarah had already grabbed her flashlight and was heading toward the sound. "Come on," she said, but I caught her arm. "Wait," I said. "Listen." Marcus's voice came again. "I found something. Follow my voice." Exactly the same words, exactly the same inflection, like a recording being played back. "That's not right," Sarah whispered, and I could see she'd noticed it too. The voice called again from a different direction. "David, Sarah, I found something." Then from another direction. "Follow my voice." We were being circled by something using Marcus's voice to lure us into the darkness. Sarah's hand found mine, her fingers ice cold and trembling. "Where is he?" she whispered. "Where is Marcus?" I didn't have an answer. The voices continued calling from the forest, multiple Marcus voices creating an impossible chorus. Sometimes they overlapped, the same words spoken in perfect unison from different locations. Sometimes they called out information that Marcus would know, our college dorm number, Sarah's middle name, the name of my ex-wife, but delivered in that same flat, emotionless tone. We retreated to our tents and tried to wait it out, but the calling continued all night. By dawn, the voices had become more elaborate, holding entire conversations. "David, I can see the way out." "Sarah, bring the medical kit." "There's someone hurt down here." "I can see lights. I think it's a rescue team." Each call was perfectly Marcus's voice, but strung together they created an uncanny valley effect that made my skin crawl. No human being spoke with such mechanical consistency. When morning finally came, the voices stopped. Sarah and I emerged from our tents to find something that made my knees buckle. Marcus's backpack, sitting beside our cold fire pit as if it had been there all along. Inside were his belongings, including his journal. The final entry, dated the day before, described finding a cave system that goes deeper than my light can reach, and voices echoing from below that sound almost like people talking. The handwriting was definitely Marcus's, but the final lines made my blood freeze. "Something down here knows our names. Going deeper to investigate. If I don't come back, don't follow the voices. They're not coming from people." Sarah read over my shoulder, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. "He was warning us," she said. "He knew something was wrong." But that raised a terrifying question. If Marcus had written this warning, who or what had been calling to us all night? The answer came at noon when Marcus walked into our campsite. He looked exactly as he had when he'd left the day before. Same clothes, same gear, same confident stride. But something was fundamentally wrong. His smile was too wide, lasting too long without changing. He blinked far too infrequently, staring at us with unmoving eyes that reflected light like an animal's. "I found the way out," he said in that flat tone we'd heard all night. "Follow me." Sarah backed away from him, her hand moving instinctively to the knife on her belt. "Marcus, where were you last night?" "Exploring," he replied without hesitation, but the smile never wavered. "I found something wonderful. We need to go now." Every instinct I had was screaming danger. This thing looked like Marcus, sounded like Marcus, but it moved with mechanical precision, never stumbling, never making the small unconscious gestures that made someone human. Real Marcus drummed his fingers when thinking, adjusted his glasses every few minutes, had a habit of running his hand through his hair when nervous. This Marcus stood perfectly still except for that unblinking stare and constant smile. "What did you find?" I asked, playing for time while trying to figure out what we were dealing with. "The way out," he repeated. "Follow me. We need to go now." It was like talking to a malfunctioning robot programmed with only a few responses. "Marcus," Sarah said carefully, "what's my middle name?" The thing that looked like Marcus turned its unsettling smile toward her. "Your name is Sarah Thompson. You are a trauma nurse. You work at Lexington General Hospital." All true, but not what she'd asked. It was parroting information without understanding context. "That's not what I asked," Sarah pressed. "What's my middle name?" The smile flickered for just a moment, revealing something underneath that made my stomach lurch. For an instant, I saw Marcus's face twisted in agony, his real eyes pleading for help from behind whatever was controlling him. Then the smile snapped back into place. "We need to go now," it said. "Follow me." I'd seen enough horror movies to know where this was leading. Whatever had Marcus wanted us to follow it deeper into the wilderness, away from any hope of rescue. But I'd also seen enough real violence in my life. Bar fights, car accidents, the aftermath of domestic calls when I'd worked as a paramedic years earlier, to know that desperate situations called for decisive action. The thing wearing Marcus's face began walking toward the tree line, moving with that unnatural steadiness. It paused and looked back with that horrible smile. "Follow me. We need to go now." I looked at Sarah and saw my own desperation reflected in her eyes. We were trapped in an impossible place. Our friend was gone or worse, and something was trying to lure us to whatever fate had befallen him. That's when Sarah did something that probably saved our lives. She stepped forward as if to follow, then suddenly lunged with her knife, driving the blade deep into the thing's back. It spun around with inhuman speed, no longer bothering to maintain the pretense. Marcus's face had become a mask of fury, but the eyes were wrong, completely black, reflecting no light at all. It grabbed Sarah by the throat with one hand and lifted her off the ground with impossible strength. I hit it with a burning log from our fire, the impact sending sparks cascading around us. It dropped Sarah, but didn't seem affected by what should have been a devastating blow. Instead, it turned those black eyes on me and smiled with too many teeth. "You should have followed," it said in Marcus's voice, but distorted now, like multiple people speaking in unison. Sarah gasped and pointed behind me. "David, look!" I turned to see more figures emerging from the tree line. A dozen people in various states of decay and wrongness, some missing limbs, others with faces that didn't quite fit their skulls, all moving with that same mechanical precision. And in the center of the group, I saw Marcus, the real Marcus. He was suspended between two of the figures, his arms stretched out like a scarecrow. His eyes were gone, replaced by empty sockets that wept blood. His mouth had been sewn shut with what looked like sinew. But he was alive. I could see his chest rising and falling, could hear muffled sounds of pain through his sealed lips. "He's still alive," Sarah whispered, and I could hear her trauma nurse instincts warring with basic survival. She wanted to help him, but we were outnumbered and surrounded by things that had once been human. The Marcus thing laughed, a sound like breaking glass. He is being prepared. Soon he will join us properly, as will you." That's when I understood what we were dealing with. These weren't ghosts or demons from local folklore. They were people who had been taken, altered, made into something else while still technically alive. The hollow was some kind of trap, collecting travelers who wandered too far from marked trails. But understanding didn't help us escape. The circle of figures was tightening, their movements coordinated like a pack of predators. Some still looked mostly human, probably recent additions to their collection. Others were so changed they barely resembled people at all. Joints bent in impossible directions, faces stretched and distorted, skin hanging in tatters. I grabbed Sarah's hand and ran toward what looked like the weakest point in their formation, a gap between two of the more decayed figures. We almost made it. Something caught my ankle and sent me sprawling. I looked back to see one of the things had extended its arm like rubber, stretching impossibly to reach us. Sarah screamed as another one grabbed her pack and began reeling her in like a fish. I cut her free with my own knife and we kept running, but there was nowhere to go. The hollow was a bowl with walls too steep to climb, and they knew the terrain better than we did. Every time we thought we'd found an escape route, more figures would emerge from the undergrowth to cut us off. We ended up back at our campsite, pressed against each other by the fire while they surrounded us. The real Marcus was brought forward, still alive but barely recognizable as human. They'd done things to him, things I won't describe in detail because some images are too terrible to share. But his eyes had been replaced with smooth black stones, and when they briefly removed the binding from his mouth, the sound that emerged wasn't entirely human anymore. "Please," Sarah whispered to the things surrounding us. "Please, don't." The Marcus thing tilted its head like a curious dog. "You will join us," it said. "You will be prepared. Then you will help us gather others." They moved forward as one, reaching for us with hands that ended in too many fingers, or no fingers at all, or things that weren't fingers but worked like them. I closed my eyes and prepared for the end. That's when the sun came up. Not gradually, like a normal sunrise, but all at once, as if someone had flipped a switch. One moment we were surrounded by nightmarish figures in the dim pre-dawn light. The next we were standing alone beside the cold ashes of our fire. The creatures were gone. The real Marcus was gone. Even our tents and gear had vanished, leaving us with only what we'd been carrying when we ran. But the hollow itself had changed. The impossible geography was gone, replaced by normal Kentucky woodland. I could see the trail we'd followed in, clear as day, leading back toward chained rock and civilization. "What happened?" Sarah asked. But I had no answer. We ran. Didn't stop to investigate, didn't try to understand. We ran for 3 hours straight, following the familiar trail markers until we reached the parking area where my truck waited exactly as we'd left it. Our phones worked again. GPS showed our correct location. Everything was normal except for the trauma carved into our memories and the fact that Marcus Chen would never be coming home. The police investigation found nothing. No trace of Marcus, no evidence we'd ever been in the hollow, no explanation for the 3 days we couldn't account for. The search and rescue teams found nothing unusual in the area we described, just normal forest with normal wildlife and normal geography. Sarah tried to tell them about the creatures, about what we'd seen, but after the third interview where they exchanged meaningful glances while she spoke, she stopped talking about it. I never said anything at all. Some truths are too strange for official reports. But I started researching after we got home. Old newspapers, local folklore, historical records from the Kentucky State Archives. What I found made my blood run cold. People have been disappearing in that area for over a century. Always in groups of 2 or 3, always experienced hikers who should have known better. The disappearances cluster around the new moon, always in October or November. The locals in Pineville have their own name for that section of forest. They call it the Hungry Hollow, and they post warnings on community boards every fall telling people to avoid it. Most disturbing were the historical accounts I found buried in old county records. In 1892, a search party found what they described as a settlement of afflicted persons in the hollow. The official report stated that these individuals were suffering from unknown ailments that had severely altered their physical appearance and mental faculties. The settlement was cleared by local authorities, but no record exists of what happened to the inhabitants. Similar reports appeared every 20 to 30 years well into the 1960s. Always the same description. Groups of people living in the hollow who had been changed in ways the reports couldn't adequately describe. Always the same official response: the settlement would be cleared, with no follow-up documentation. The last official report was from 1967, but the disappearances continued. The authorities just stopped investigating too closely. I think the things in the hollow are what remain of everyone who ever got trapped there. Generations of hikers, hunters, and travelers transformed into something that's still technically alive but no longer human. They're patient, methodical, and they've learned exactly how to lure people into their trap. The carved symbols we saw on the trees? I found similar markings in historical accounts dating back to the 1800s. They're not just decorations, they're boundary markers, defining the edges of a hunting ground that exists partially outside normal space and time. Sarah and I don't talk anymore. We tried, those first few weeks, meeting for coffee and attempting to process what had happened. But every conversation ended the same way, with both of us staring into our drinks, unable to explain how we'd escaped when Marcus hadn't. She blamed herself for not being fast enough with the knife, for not being able to save him. I blamed myself for suggesting the trip in the first place, for bringing us to that cursed place. The guilt was eating us both alive, creating a shared trauma we couldn't discuss without reopening wounds that refused to heal. The last time I saw her was at Marcus's memorial service. His parents had organized it after the official search was called off, a celebration of life for a son who would never be coming home. Sarah sat in the back, her face hollow with grief and sleepless nights. We made eye contact once across the room, a moment of shared understanding that somehow made everything worse. She moved to Oregon 6 months later, sent me a postcard saying she'd found work at a hospital in Portland, that she needed to be somewhere with mountains that felt different. I understood. Kentucky's hills would always carry echoes of that hollow for both of us. I've thought about going back, not to the hollow itself, I'm not that broken, not yet, but to Pineville, to talk to the locals who've lived with this knowledge for generations. Maybe they have answers, or at least better questions than the ones that keep me awake at night. But I'm afraid of what I might learn. Afraid I might discover that what happened to us wasn't an isolated incident, that the Hungry Hollow is just one of many such places scattered across the wilderness. Afraid I might find out that Marcus is still alive down there, changed into something that wears his face while hunting new victims. Most of all, I'm afraid I might discover that part of me never really left that place. Sometimes, in the early hours before dawn, I catch myself listening for voices calling from the darkness. Sometimes I wake up with dirt under my fingernails and no memory of how it got there. Sometimes I look in the mirror and wonder if my smile lasts too long, if I blink often enough, if the person looking back is entirely human. The rational part of my mind says it's trauma, PTSD from an experience that broke something fundamental in my understanding of reality. But late at night, when the shadows seem deeper than they should be, and I hear sounds that might be voices calling my name, I wonder if the hollow's influence extends beyond its physical boundaries. I wonder if it's still hunting, using those of us who escaped as unwitting bait to lure others to the same fate. I've been having dreams lately. Dreams of walking through familiar forest, following a trail that should lead home, but somehow curves back on itself. Dreams of Marcus calling to me from the darkness, asking me to follow his voice. Dreams where I wake up standing in my backyard at 3 a.m., facing south toward Kentucky, with no memory of how I got there. The worst part is that the dreams feel like memories. 3 weeks ago, I caught myself researching hiking trails in remote areas of West Virginia. Last week, I found camping gear in my closet that I don't remember buying. Yesterday, I discovered I'd made reservations at a campground near Seneca Rocks for next weekend. Reservations I have no memory of making. I'm writing this down as a warning. Maybe to others, maybe just to the part of myself that's still fighting whatever influence is spreading through my mind like a slow poison. If you're reading this and you know me, if I've tried to convince you to go camping in an area that seems wrong somehow, don't listen. Don't follow me into the wilderness. And if I disappear, don't come looking. Some places are meant to stay lost, and some prices are too high to pay for rescue. The hollow is patient. It can wait decades between feedings if necessary. But it never stops hunting, and it never forgets those who've seen its true nature. I can feel it calling to me even now. A whisper at the edge of hearing that promises rest, promises answers, promises an end to the guilt and trauma that's been eating me alive since that October night. Part of me wants to answer that call, to walk back into the darkness and join Marcus in whatever existence awaits those who surrender to the hollow's hunger. But I'm going to fight it as long as I can. Going to keep writing, keep documenting, keep trying to warn others about what's waiting in the deep woods of Appalachia. Because Marcus is still down there. Sarah and I both know it, even if we've never said it out loud. He's still alive in some form, still suffering, still being used as bait for the next group of hikers who wander too far from marked trails. And someday, whether by choice or compulsion, I'm going back for him. God help me, I'm going back. My name is Jennifer Williams, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the Daniel Boone National Forest, deep in the mountains of southeastern Kentucky, where the old coal towns gave way to endless stretches of wilderness that seemed to swallow sound itself. I should have known something was wrong when Marcus suggested Bell County for our camping trip. My boyfriend of 3 years had always been the practical one, the type who researched campsites months in advance, checked weather patterns, and packed emergency supplies we'd never need. But that October, he seemed different, restless. He'd wake up in the middle of the night, staring out our apartment window at nothing, muttering about needing to get back to the mountains. "There's this place," he'd said, spreading a topographic map across our kitchen table. His finger traced a winding trail that ended at a hollow called Devil's Backbone Ridge. My grandfather used to tell stories about it, said the Cherokee avoided it, even before the coal companies came through. I should have asked more questions then. Should have wondered why Marcus suddenly cared about his grandfather's stories when he'd spent years dismissing them as hillbilly superstition. Instead, I focused on the practical details. How remote it was, how we'd need to hike 8 miles from the nearest road, how cell service would be non-existent. "That's the point," Marcus had said, and something in his voice made me look up. His eyes had a glassy quality I'd never seen before, like he was seeing something I couldn't. We need to disconnect, really disconnect. Our friend Derek Hernandez had been enthusiastic about the trip, probably because it meant time away from his messy divorce proceedings. Derek was one of those guys who threw himself into outdoor adventures whenever life got complicated. Rock climbing, whitewater rafting, backcountry camping. He owned enough gear to outfit a small expedition and had the kind of infectious enthusiasm that made even mundane hikes feel like grand adventures. "Devil's Backbone Ridge," he'd said, rolling the name around in his mouth like he was tasting something exotic. "Sounds metal as hell. I'm in." The drive to Kentucky took us through increasingly remote territory. We left the interstate for state highways, then state highways for county roads, and finally county roads for a rutted dirt track that Marcus insisted was correct despite what my GPS was telling us. The trees pressed closer to the road with each mile, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even at midday, we drove through pockets of shadow that felt like premature twilight. "You sure about this, man?" Derek asked from the back seat, his usual enthusiasm tempered by the increasingly desolate landscape. "Because I'm pretty sure my GPS just gave up and started crying." Marcus didn't answer. He was gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles, leaning forward like he was being pulled by something we couldn't see. I reached over to touch his arm, and his skin was fever-hot despite the October chill. "Marcus, you okay?" He blinked slowly, as if coming out of a trance. Yeah, we're almost there." The trailhead, when we finally found it, was little more than a gap in the tree line marked by a weathered wooden sign that looked like it hadn't been maintained in decades. "Devil's Backbone Ridge Trail, 8.2 miles to Overlook," it read, though someone had scratched out additional text below that I couldn't quite make out. We shouldered our packs and started hiking. The trail was well-defined at first, winding through second-growth forest where the leaves were just beginning to turn. Derek kept up a steady stream of chatter about work, his ex-wife, a new climbing gym he'd discovered. I found his voice comforting, a normal human sound in a place that seemed to absorb noise like a sponge. But as we climbed higher, Derek's chatter began to fade. The forest around us was too quiet. No bird songs, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, no buzz of insects. Just the sound of our boots on the trail and our increasingly labored breathing as the path grew steeper. "Weird how quiet it is," Derek said during our first rest stop, echoing my thoughts. He was checking his phone out of habit, though we all knew there was no signal. "Usually, these mountains are full of life." Marcus was standing apart from us, staring up the trail with that same glassy expression. When I followed his gaze, I saw nothing but trees and shadows, but something about the way the light fell made my skin crawl. It was like looking at a photograph where the proportions were slightly wrong, everything familiar but somehow threatening. "Marcus," I said, louder than necessary. "Ready to keep going?" He turned to me, and for just a moment I didn't recognize the person looking back. His face was slack, his eyes unfocused like he was sleepwalking. Then he blinked, and he was Marcus again. My Marcus, with his crooked smile and the way he always touched my hand when he was thinking. "Sorry, this place brings back memories." But Marcus had never been to Kentucky before. I was sure of that. We'd talked about our childhoods enough times that I knew he'd grown up in suburban Ohio, had never been camping until college, had learned everything he knew about the outdoors from YouTube videos and REI classes. The trail continued to climb, switchbacking up the ridge through increasingly ancient-looking forest. The trees here were different, taller, more gnarled, with bark that looked almost black in the filtered light. Some of them were enormous, easily old enough to predate European settlement, maybe even old enough to remember the Cherokee that Marcus's grandfather had mentioned. It was Derek who first noticed the marks. "Check this out," he said, stopping beside one of the massive oaks. "Looks like something's been clawing at these trees." The gouges in the bark were deep, running in parallel lines about 7 feet up the trunk. They were too high and too large to be from any normal wildlife I knew about. Black bears, maybe, but these marks looked almost deliberate, like something had been trying to strip away the bark in specific patterns. "Probably just deer rubbing," Marcus said without looking, but his voice had that distant quality again. "We should keep moving. Want to make camp before dark." Derek and I exchanged a look. It was barely 3 in the afternoon, and we'd planned to hike until at least 5. But something in Marcus's tone discouraged argument, and honestly, I was starting to feel anxious about the place too. The quiet was oppressive now, so complete that I found myself holding my breath, waiting for some sound to break the silence. We hiked for another 2 hours without speaking much. The trail followed the ridgeline, offering occasional glimpses through the trees of the valleys below. From up here, the forest stretched endlessly in all directions, an unbroken carpet of green and gold that looked beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. No roads, no houses, no signs of human presence except the narrow trail we followed. It was Derek who spotted the campsite first, a small clearing just off the trail where someone had built a fire ring from local stones. The site was obviously used, but not recently. Charcoal and ash filled the ring. But it was old, gray, and cold. A few pieces of rusted camping gear were scattered around the edges of the clearing. A bent tent stake, a torn piece of nylon fabric, a camping mug with a hole rusted through the bottom. "Looks like someone left in a hurry," Derek said, kicking at the tent stake. Or maybe they just didn't care about leave-no-trace principles. I was examining the fire ring, and something about it bothered me. The stones were arranged too precisely, almost ceremonially. They were all the same type of rock, a dark, local stone that seemed to absorb light, and they'd been placed with obvious care. It didn't look like a simple camping fire ring. It looked like something else entirely. "Marcus," I said, "maybe we should find another spot. This feels weird." But Marcus was already dropping his pack at the edge of the clearing. "This is perfect," he said, and again his voice had that dreamy quality. "This is exactly right." We set up camp as the sun began to sink toward the tree line. Derek pitched his tent on the far side of the clearing, chattering nervously about proper tent site selection and drainage patterns. I helped Marcus with our two-person tent, though he seemed to know exactly where to place it without any discussion or the usual debate about the best spot. As darkness fell, the oppressive quiet of the forest became even more pronounced. We'd gathered wood for a fire, though finding dry kindling had been strangely difficult, as if the forest were too damp, too alive, too resistant to giving up its dead wood. When we finally got the fire started, it burned wrong. The flames were too blue, too cold-looking, and they threw shadows that seemed to move independently of our movements around the fire. "So," Derek said, trying to inject some normalcy into the evening, "what's the plan for tomorrow? Check out that overlook you mentioned?" Marcus was staring into the fire with that same distant expression. "My grandfather used to tell stories about this place," he said, ignoring Derek's question. "Said the Cherokee called it the Hungry Hollow. Said something lived here that fed on more than just flesh." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October night. "Marcus, you've never mentioned your grandfather before, haven't I?" He looked up at me, and in the firelight his face looked different. Older, hungrier. "He used to say the thing in the hollow could take your shape, use your voice, make your loved ones trust it while it fed." Derek laughed nervously. "Okay, that's sufficiently creepy. Thanks for saving that story until after dark in the middle of nowhere." But I was studying Marcus's face, trying to understand the change I was seeing. This wasn't the man I'd been living with for 3 years. This wasn't the person who left me notes in my lunch, who knew exactly how I liked my coffee, who could make me laugh even on my worst days. This was someone else wearing Marcus's face. "I'm tired," I announced, standing up abruptly. "I think I'll turn in." I expected Marcus to follow me. We'd shared a tent on dozens of camping trips, and our routine was well established, but he just nodded absently and continued staring into the fire. "I'll stay up for a while," he said. "Keep the fire going." Inside the tent, I lay in my sleeping bag and listened to the muffled conversation outside. Derek was telling stories about his climbing adventures, but Marcus's responses were monosyllabic, distracted. Eventually, Derek gave up and announced he was going to bed too. I must have dozed off because I was awakened by voices outside the tent. Marcus was talking to someone in low, urgent tones, but I couldn't make out the words. The other voice was unfamiliar, higher-pitched, almost musical. I checked my watch. 2:17 a.m. Quietly, I unzipped the tent flap just enough to peer out. Marcus was sitting by the fire which had burned down to embers. But he wasn't alone. There was a figure sitting across from him, partially obscured by smoke and shadow. From what I could see, it looked like a child, small, slight, with long dark hair that seemed to move in a breeze I couldn't feel. Marcus was speaking to it like he'd known it forever, his voice warm and familiar in a way that made my heart ache. This was how he used to talk to me in the early days of our relationship, when everything was new and wonderful and full of possibility. "Been waiting so long," he was saying. "I tried to stay away, but you kept calling me back." The child figure said something I couldn't hear, and Marcus laughed, a sound I hadn't heard from him in months. "Of course I brought them. You said you were hungry." Ice water flooded my veins. I looked toward Derek's tent, but it was still and silent. Either he was sleeping through this conversation, or... The child turned toward my tent, and in the dying firelight I caught a glimpse of its face. It was beautiful and terrible, with features that seemed to shift and change as I watched. Sometimes it looked like a young girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old. But then the shadows would shift, and I'd see something else. Something ancient and predatory with too many teeth and eyes that reflected light like an animal's. "She's awake," the thing said, and its voice carried clearly across the clearing. It sounded exactly like Marcus's voice, which should have been impossible. Marcus turned toward the tent, and when I saw his face, I had to bite my knuckle to keep from screaming. His features were the same, but everything else was wrong. His expression was empty, hungry, and when he smiled, his teeth looked sharp in the firelight. "Jennifer," he called softly. "Come join us. There's someone I'd like you to meet." I pressed myself against the back of the tent, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure they could hear it. This wasn't Marcus. Whatever was sitting by the fire wearing my boyfriend's face, it wasn't the person I loved. "Jennifer," the thing called again, and this time its voice was perfect. Exactly Marcus's tone, exactly his inflection when he was being gentle and coaxing. "Don't be scared. She just wants to talk." The child thing laughed, a sound like wind chimes made of bone. "She can smell the fear," it said in Marcus's voice. "It makes the meat sweeter." I had to get out of there. Had to get to Derek, had to get help, had to get away from whatever was happening in this cursed clearing. Moving as quietly as I could, I pulled on my boots and grabbed my jacket. My pack was outside by the fire, but I couldn't risk trying to retrieve it. The back of the tent faced away from the fire, toward the tree line. If I could cut through the fabric without making noise, I might be able to slip into the forest and circle around to Derek's tent. It was a desperate plan, but it was the only one I had. I used my pocket knife to make a small slit in the tent wall, then carefully widened it until I could squeeze through. The night air was shockingly cold, and frost was already forming on the grass. I crept toward Derek's tent, staying low, using every shadow to hide my movement. "Derek," I whispered as quietly as I could manage when I reached his tent. "Derek, wake up!" No response. The tent was perfectly still. "Derek," I whispered more urgently, gently shaking the tent wall. Still nothing. Either he was sleeping incredibly deeply, or... I unzipped his tent flap as quietly as possible and peered inside. Derek's sleeping bag was there, but it was empty. The bag was unzipped from the inside, as if he'd gotten up in the middle of the night and simply walked away. Behind me, I heard Marcus laugh, that warm, familiar sound that now filled me with terror. "Looking for your friend?" he called. "He went for a walk with our new friend. They should be back soon." I turned slowly, knowing I'd been caught. Marcus was standing at the edge of the clearing, silhouetted against the dying fire. The child thing was nowhere to be seen, but I could feel its presence in the shadows between the trees. "Where is Derek?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Safe," Marcus said, taking a step toward me. "Happy. He's learning about the old ways, about what this place really is." "You're not Marcus." The words came out as a whisper, but they felt like the truest thing I'd ever said. The thing wearing Marcus's face smiled, and in the dim light I could see that its teeth were indeed sharper than they should be. "Of course I am. I'm exactly who I've always been. You just never looked closely enough." "Prove it," I said. "Tell me something only Marcus would know." Its smile widened. "Your middle name is Rose, after your grandmother. You have a scar on your left knee from when you fell off your bike when you were 7. You're afraid of spiders, but you pretend not to be because you think it makes you seem weak. You cry during animal movies, but never admit it. You love the way I make coffee in the morning, even though it's too strong for most people." Each detail hit me like a physical blow. This thing knew everything about me, everything about my relationship with Marcus. But knowledge wasn't the same as being, and there was something fundamentally wrong with the way it delivered these intimate facts, like it was reciting lines from a script rather than sharing memories. "You taste like copper and fear," it added conversationally, and you dream about drowning at least once a week. The last detail made me stumble backward. I'd never told Marcus about the drowning dreams, had never told anyone. They'd started in childhood and never really stopped. Vivid nightmares where I was trapped underwater, unable to breathe, unable to scream, unable to escape. How do you know that? I know everything about you, Jennifer. I've been watching you for months, learning you, preparing for this moment. It took another step closer, and I could smell something wrong about it, a scent like old meat and wet earth. Marcus made it so easy. He was already hollow inside, already hungry for something more than what his little life could offer. All I had to do was whisper the right suggestions, plant the right dreams. Behind me, I heard footsteps in the forest. Slow, deliberate footsteps that sounded like someone walking through thick mud. The child thing was coming back, and it wasn't alone. "Derek," I called into the darkness. "Derek, if you can hear me, we need to get out of here." The footsteps stopped, and then Derek's voice drifted out of the trees. But something was wrong with it. The tone was flat, emotionless, like he was speaking in his sleep. "Jennifer," he said, "you should come see what I found. It's beautiful." "No," I whispered, backing away from both voices. "No, this isn't real." But Derek emerged from the tree line, and I could see immediately that whatever had happened to Marcus had happened to him too. His face was slack, his eyes unfocused, and when he smiled, it was with someone else's expression. "She showed me the truth about this place," Derek said in that flat, dreamy voice, "about what it really wants, what it really needs. We can feed it together, Jennifer. We can be part of something so much bigger than our small, stupid lives." The child thing materialized beside him, and now I could see it clearly. It was wearing the face of a little girl, maybe 8 years old, with dark hair and huge, innocent eyes. But its smile was ancient and terrible, and when it moved, its proportions were wrong. Too tall, too thin, joints bending in directions that human joints shouldn't bend. "Hello, Jennifer," it said in a voice that sounded like every child who had ever been lost in these mountains. "I've been so looking forward to meeting you." I ran. I crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and skin, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Behind me, I could hear them calling my name, Marcus's voice, Derek's voice, and underneath it all, that terrible, childlike giggle that seemed to come from every direction at once. The forest was a maze of shadows and obstacles. Roots caught my feet, low branches slapped my face, and every few steps I had to stop and listen for the sound of pursuit. But the thing that terrified me most was the silence. No matter how much noise I made crashing through the underbrush, the forest absorbed it all, leaving me isolated in a bubble of my own panic. I had no idea which direction I was going. The trail was somewhere behind me, but I'd lost it in my panicked flight. All I could do was keep moving, keep putting distance between myself and whatever was happening in that clearing. After what felt like hours, I stumbled into another small clearing. This one was different from our campsite, wilder, more ancient-looking. The trees around it were enormous, their trunks scarred with the same claw marks we'd seen on the trail. In the center of the clearing was a ring of standing stones, each one about 4 feet tall and carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. I was examining the stones when I heard Marcus's voice behind me. "There you are," he said, sounding perfectly normal, perfectly concerned. "Jesus, Jen, you scared me. I woke up and you were gone." I spun around and there he was, my Marcus, looking exactly like himself. His hair was mussed from sleep, his face creased with worry, and he was wearing the same clothes he'd had on around the campfire. For a moment, my heart soared with relief. "Marcus?" I whispered. "Of course it's me," he said, stepping into the clearing. "What happened? Derek's gone too. His tent is empty. I think something might have gotten them." He looked so much like himself that I almost ran to him, almost threw myself into his arms and let him comfort me like he had 100 times before. But something held me back. some instinct that had kept my ancestors alive long enough to pass their genes down to me. "What's my middle name?" I asked. He frowned as if confused by the question. "Rose, Jennifer Rose Williams. Jen, what's going on? What am I afraid of?" "Spiders," he said immediately. "And drowning. You have these dreams." It was him. It had to be him. But something was still wrong, some detail that my subconscious had picked up on even if my conscious mind couldn't identify it. "Where did we first meet?" I asked. "College," he said. "You were studying for your biology exam in the library, and I asked if you needed help with the organic chemistry section." That was right too. Every detail was perfect, every memory accurate. But the way he told it was wrong, like he was reciting facts rather than remembering moments that had shaped his life. "You're not him," I said, taking a step backward. His expression didn't change. "Of course I am. Jen, you're scaring me. What happened out there?" "Prove it," I said. "Tell me something only Marcus would know. Something we never talked about. Something private." For just a moment, his mask slipped. The concern in his eyes was replaced by something cold and calculating, something that was trying to figure out what I wanted to hear. "I don't understand what you want from me," he said, and his voice carried a hint of petulance that was completely unlike Marcus. "I want you to tell me about the time you cried in the shower after your father's funeral," I said. "I want you to tell me about the panic attacks you get in crowded places that you think I don't notice. I want you to tell me about the scar on your back that you've never explained." The thing wearing Marcus's face stared at me for a long moment, and then it smiled. Not Marcus's smile, something else entirely, something hungry and triumphant. "Clever girl," it said, and its voice was changing, becoming something layered and strange. Most people would have run to me by now. "Where is he?" I demanded. "Where's the real Marcus?" "He's right here," it said, spreading its arms wide. "I am everything he was, everything he ever wanted to be, everything he dreamed of becoming. I'm just more." The thing began to change as I watched, its borrowed features shifting and melting like wax in a fire. Marcus's face stretched and distorted, becoming something alien and terrible. Its body grew taller, thinner, joints bending at impossible angles. But the worst part was that it was still recognizably Marcus underneath all the horror, like looking at a photograph that had been burned and twisted but not quite destroyed. "He came to me willingly," it said in a voice that was now a harmony of different tones, some human, some not. "He was so tired of being ordinary, so hungry for something more. All I did was offer him what he really wanted." "What are you?" I whispered. "I am what feeds in the hollow places," it said. "What grows in the spaces between what is and what might be. Your kind has many names for me, but names have power, and I prefer to remain undefined." Behind the creature, I saw movement in the trees. Derek emerged from the shadows, but like Marcus, he was wrong. His face was too pale, his movements too fluid, and his eyes reflected light like an animal's. "She won't come willingly," Derek said in a voice that was flat and emotionless. "No," the Marcus thing agreed, "but that's all right. Fear makes the feeding sweeter." They began to circle me, moving with the coordinated precision of predators. I backed toward the ring of standing stones, hoping they might offer some protection, some barrier against whatever these things had become. As soon as I stepped inside the stone circle, everything changed. The oppressive quiet of the forest was broken by a sound like wind through empty houses, and the carved symbols on the stones began to glow with a cold, blue light. The creatures stopped their advance, hissing like cats. "Clever girl," the Marcus thing said again, but now its voice carried a note of frustration. "But you can't stay there forever." I looked around the stone circle, trying to understand what I'd stumbled into. The symbols carved into the rocks were unlike anything I'd ever seen. Not Cherokee, not any Native American script I was familiar with. They looked older, more primal, like something that had been carved by people who understood forces that modern humanity had forgotten. In the center of the circle, the ground was different. Where elsewhere the forest floor was covered with fallen leaves and undergrowth, here the earth was bare and dark, as if nothing had grown here for centuries. But as I watched, small objects began to surface from the soil. Pieces of bone, scraps of fabric, personal items that looked like they'd been buried for decades. A wedding ring, a pair of broken glasses, a child's toy, a military dog tag from the Korean War. "How many?" I whispered. "How many people have you killed?" "Not killed," the Marcus thing corrected. "Transformed, improved, given purpose beyond their small, meaningless lives." But the evidence at my feet told a different story. These weren't the belongings of people who had been transformed. They were the remnants of people who had been consumed, digested, forgotten by everything except the cold earth that held their bones. As dawn began to break through the trees, the creatures became more agitated. They paced around the stone circle like caged animals, their borrowed faces flickering between human and something else. I realized that the light was hurting them somehow, forcing them to maintain their human disguises when they wanted to show their true forms. "You can't stay there forever," Derek said, echoing the Marcus thing's earlier words. "Eventually, you'll have to sleep. Eventually, you'll have to eat. And when you do, we'll be waiting." But I was studying the symbols on the stones, trying to understand their meaning. Some of them looked like warnings, others like instructions. And gradually a plan began to form in my mind. Desperate and probably suicidal, but the only chance I had. The stones weren't just markers or barriers. They were part of something larger, something designed to contain what lived in this hollow. But the circle was incomplete. One stone was missing, leaving a gap in the pattern that the creatures could exploit. I began to search the area inside the circle, looking for anything that might complete the pattern. The bone fragments and personal effects were scattered randomly, but underneath them, I found what I was looking for. Another carved stone, smaller than the others, partially buried in the dark earth. As I pulled it free, the creatures outside the circle became frantic. They threw themselves against some invisible barrier, screaming in voices that were no longer human. The Marcus thing's face was a mask of rage and hunger, its borrowed features distorting into something nightmarish. "Don't," it said, and for just a moment I heard Marcus's real voice underneath the monster's words. "Please, Jennifer, I'm still in here. If you complete the circle, you'll trap me too." I hesitated, the stone heavy in my hands. Was it possible that Marcus was still alive somewhere inside that thing? Was there some chance I could save him? "He's lying," said a new voice from the edge of the clearing. I turned to see a figure standing just outside the stone circle, an elderly man in worn camping clothes, his face weathered by decades of sun and wind. He looked solid, real, human in a way that Marcus and Derek no longer did. "Who are you?" I asked. "Name's Henry Morrison," he said. "Been hunting this thing for 30 years, ever since it took my son and daughter-in-law on their honeymoon camping trip." The creatures had stopped their assault on the barrier and were now staring at the old man with obvious fear. "Thought you were dead. Bold man," the Marcus thing snarled. "Not yet," Henry replied calmly, "though you've certainly tried." He turned to me. "That stone you're holding, it's the keystone. Place it in the gap, and the binding will be complete. The thing you're looking at isn't your boyfriend anymore. It consumed him the moment he stepped into this hollow." "But he knew things," I said. "Personal things about me, about our relationship." "It feeds on more than flesh," Henry explained. "It devours memories, experiences, everything that makes a person who they are. Then it uses those stolen memories to lure in new prey." The Marcus thing was speaking again, pleading with Marcus's voice, using every trick it had learned from consuming the man I loved. But I could see the truth now, could see past the borrowed face to the hunger underneath. "I'm sorry," I whispered and placed the keystone in the gap. The effect was immediate and terrible. Light blazed from the completed circle, and the creatures inside began to scream, not with human voices, but with sounds that predated language, that spoke of rage and hunger older than civilization. The stolen faces melted away, revealing the truth beneath, something that might once have been human but had been transformed by decades of feeding into something else entirely. The light grew brighter, and the screaming faded. When my vision cleared, the clearing was empty except for Henry and me. The creatures were gone, but so was any trace of Marcus or Derek. Even their borrowed voices were silent. "Are they dead?" I asked. Henry shook his head. "Bound, contained. This place has been a trap for longer than anyone remembers. The Cherokee knew it, avoided it, but they also knew how to maintain the bindings. When the coal companies came through, when the old knowledge was forgotten, the thing in the hollow grew stronger." "How do you know all this?" "Spent 30 years learning," he said simply. 30 years preparing for this moment. My boy and his wife weren't the first, and they wouldn't have been the last if we hadn't stopped it tonight. As the sun rose fully above the tree line, Henry led me back toward the trail. The forest seemed different now, still quiet, but no longer oppressive. Birds were beginning to sing, and I could hear the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now you go home," Henry said. "You try to forget what you saw here, try to build a life from what's left, and you never come back to this place. What about you?" "Someone needs to maintain the bindings," he said. "Make sure the circle stays complete. It's not much of a life, but it's better than letting that thing loose on the world." We walked in silence for a while, each lost in our own thoughts. Finally, as we reached the trailhead where my car was parked, I had to ask the question that had been burning in my mind. "Henry, is there any chance at all, that Marcus might still be alive somewhere?" The old man looked at me with eyes that had seen too much pain, too much loss. "I asked myself that same question for 30 years, he said, "and the answer is always the same. The people we loved are gone. What's left behind isn't them, no matter how much it might look or sound like them." I drove home that day through the same winding roads we'd taken on the way in, but everything looked different. The mountains that had seemed mysterious and inviting now looked like teeth against the sky. The forests that had promised adventure now seemed to hide unspeakable things in their shadows. I never reported Marcus and Derek missing. How could I? How could I explain what had really happened in that hollow without sounding insane? Instead, I told their families and friends that they'd decided to extend their camping trip, that they'd be back in a few days. Then, a few days became a week became a month, and eventually everyone assumed they'd had some kind of accident in the wilderness. Search and rescue teams combed the Daniel Boone National Forest for weeks. They found our abandoned campsite, found signs of our presence on the trail, but no trace of what had become of two experienced hikers. The official report listed them as missing, presumed dead, victims of the wilderness that claimed a few unprepared souls every year. I moved out of the apartment Marcus and I had shared, changed jobs, tried to start over, but the memories followed me. Not just memories of what I'd seen in that clearing, but memories of Marcus himself, the real Marcus I'd loved and lost to something hungry and ancient. Sometimes, late at night, I'll get a phone call from an unknown number. When I answer, there's silence on the other end, but I can feel something listening, waiting. And sometimes, just before I hang up, I'll hear a whisper that sounds like Marcus's voice saying my name. I know it's not him. I know the real Marcus is gone, consumed by something that wore his face to hunt new prey. But knowing doesn't make the calls any less terrifying, any less heartbreaking. Henry was right. I've tried to forget, tried to build a new life from the pieces that remain, but some things can't be forgotten, can't be left behind. The hollow changed me, marked me in ways I'm still discovering. I don't camp anymore. Don't hike alone. Don't go to places where the cell service fails and the old hungers might still be waiting. Because I know now that there are things in the remote places of the world that are older than human civilization, things that have learned to use our love against us, to wear the faces of the people we trust most. And I know that somewhere in the mountains of southeastern Kentucky, an old man sits watching a circle of stones, making sure the bindings hold, making sure the hungry thing stays trapped in its hollow prison. But sometimes I wonder what will happen when Henry gets too old to maintain his vigil. What will happen when he dies and there's no one left who knows the truth about Devil's Backbone Ridge? Will the thing in the hollow find a way to break free? Will it resume its hunting, wearing new faces, speaking with new voices, luring new victims into its web of borrowed memories and stolen love? The thought keeps me awake at night. It's why I'm writing this down, why I'm leaving this record of what really happened in those mountains. Because someone needs to know, someone needs to remember. If you're reading this, if something has happened to Henry, if the bindings have failed, stay away from Devil's Backbone Ridge. Don't go looking for the truth. Don't try to verify my story. The thing that waits there is patient, clever, and eternally hungry. It will study you, learn you, become whatever it needs to become to earn your trust. And when it speaks to you with the voice of someone you love, when it looks at you with familiar eyes and tells you everything you've always wanted to hear, remember that love can be stolen, faces can be worn like masks, and some hungers are too old and too deep to ever be satisfied. The mountains keep their secrets well, but some secrets are too dangerous to stay buried forever. This is mine. This is my warning. This is my gift to anyone who might one day face the same choice I faced, between saving what you love and stopping what you fear. I chose to stop it. I chose to complete the circle. My name is Kenneth Young, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the remote hollows of Pine Mountain State Resort Park, deep in the Appalachian wilderness of eastern Kentucky, where the old coal mines have left scars in the earth that never properly healed. I should have listened to the ranger at the visitor center when he mentioned the missing hikers. 3 separate incidents in the past 2 months, he'd said, shaking his grizzled head. Folks just vanish up in them hollers. Course, could be they got turned around, fell down a mine shaft. A lot of unmarked ones up there. But I was too focused on impressing Sarah to pay proper attention to his warnings. Sarah Martinez and I had been dating for 8 months, and this camping trip was supposed to be our romantic getaway, a chance to disconnect from our demanding jobs at the Louisville accounting firm and reconnect with each other. She'd been distant lately, working late, taking calls she wouldn't explain. I thought a few days in the wilderness might bring back the woman I'd fallen in love with. "You sure about this place?" Sarah asked as we parked at the trailhead near Chained Rock. Her dark eyes scanned the tree line with obvious unease. "It feels so empty." The afternoon sun filtered through the canopy of oak and maple, casting long shadows that seemed to writhe in my peripheral vision. The air hung thick with humidity and the earthy smell of decay. Too rich, too sweet. Even the usual forest sounds seemed muted, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. "Come on, it'll be perfect," I insisted, shouldering my pack. No cell service, no distractions, just us and nature. Sarah's phone had already lost signal, same as mine. We'd planned for that, but something about the sudden digital silence felt ominous rather than liberating. The GPS device I'd brought as backup flickered erratically, the screen pixelating before going dark entirely. "Piece of junk," I muttered, giving it a shake. "Good thing I brought paper maps, too." We hiked for 3 hours along the Pine Mountain Trail, following old logging roads that had been reclaimed by the forest. The path meandered through stands of hemlock and rhododendron, past tumbling streams that should have been peaceful but somehow sounded wrong. Their babbling had an almost conversational quality that made me strain to understand words that weren't there. By late afternoon, we reached our intended campsite near a small clearing overlooking the valley. The view should have been breathtaking, but a strange haze hung over the distant mountains, giving everything a sickly, sepia tone. "Look at that," Sarah whispered, pointing to a cluster of deteriorating structures barely visible through the trees about a quarter-mile away. "What do you think that is?" I consulted my map, but the buildings weren't marked. Probably an old mining camp. This whole area was strip-mined back in the 60s. I tried to sound casual, but something about those abandoned structures sent ice water through my veins. They were too uniform, too deliberately placed. And was that smoke rising from one of the chimneys? "We should stay away from there," Sarah said, unconsciously moving closer to me. "There could be unstable structures or—" A branch snapped in the woods behind us. We both spun around but saw nothing except the darkening forest. The sound had been too loud, too deliberate to be a squirrel or bird. "Probably just a deer," I said, but my voice cracked slightly. We set up camp quickly, driven by an urgency neither of us wanted to acknowledge. The tent went up without issue, but when I tried to start our campfire, the matches kept guttering out despite the still air. The lighter worked fine for everything else, but every time I held the flame to kindling, it would sputter and die. "That's weird," Sarah murmured, kneeling beside me. Her fingers were ice cold as they brushed mine. On the 7th try, the fire finally caught, but the flames burned with an unnatural blue-green tinge that made both our faces look corpse-pale in its light. "Must be some mineral in the wood," I said, but we both knew that didn't make sense. I'd been camping for years and had never seen anything like it. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped faster than it should have for early October. Our breath began to mist, and frost formed on the inside of our water bottles despite the day's warmth. Sarah huddled against me, shivering. "Ken, something's wrong here," she whispered. "I can feel it, like we're being watched." I wanted to dismiss her fears, but I felt it too. That crawling sensation between my shoulder blades, the certainty that hostile eyes were studying us from the tree line. The normal sounds of a forest at night were completely absent. No owls, no rustling leaves, no insect chorus. Just an oppressive silence that pressed against my eardrums like cotton. Around midnight, I woke to Sarah shaking me violently. "Did you hear that?" she hissed. I sat up, instantly alert. From somewhere in the direction of the abandoned buildings came a sound like singing, multiple voices raised in harmony, but the melody was wrong, discordant, with too many notes that human throats shouldn't be able to produce. What the hell? I unzipped the tent flap and peered out. The fire had died to barely glowing embers, casting almost no light. But in the distance, I could see flickering illumination from the ruins. Not the warm yellow of electric lights or candles, but that same sickly blue-green as our campfire. The singing stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete it felt like being buried alive. "We need to leave," Sarah whispered. "Right now." "In the dark?" "Sarah, be rational. We could fall into a mine shaft or—" "I don't care!" Her voice rose to just below a shout. "Something is very, very wrong here, and if we stay until morning, we're going to die." Before I could respond, we heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, approaching through the underbrush. But they were wrong. The rhythm was off, as if whoever was walking had too many legs or joints that bent in the wrong directions. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it toward the sound. The beam seemed weaker than it should be, swallowed by the darkness after only a few feet. But in that brief illumination, I saw something that made my bladder nearly release. It looked like a person at first glance, tall, thin, dressed in what might once have been clothes. But the proportions were subtly wrong. The arms hung too low, the fingers were too long, and when it turned its head toward our light, I caught a glimpse of eyes that reflected like an animal's. "Jesus Christ," I breathed. The thing smiled. I could see the flash of too many teeth, and then melted back into the shadows like smoke. "Pack. Now." I began throwing our gear into bags with shaking hands, but when I looked for my paper maps, they were gone. I was certain I'd left them in the tent's side pocket, but the compartment was empty. More unsettling, our food supplies had taken on a rotten smell overnight, despite being sealed in airtight containers. We broke camp in record time, using our phone's flashlight function since they still worked even without signal. The forest seemed to close in around us as we stumbled down the trail, branches catching at our clothes like grasping fingers. "The path," Sarah gasped after we'd been walking for 20 minutes. "Ken, this isn't the same trail we took up." She was right. The path we were following was narrower, overgrown, and led steadily downhill in a direction that felt wrong according to my internal compass. Worse, carved into the trees along the trail were symbols I didn't recognize. Crude slashes and spirals that looked fresh despite the age of the bark around them. "We must have taken a wrong turn in the dark," I said, but doubt gnawed at me. How could we have gotten so turned around? The trail eventually led us to a clearing where the remains of several buildings squatted like broken teeth. This was definitely not the same abandoned mining camp we'd seen from our campsite. This one was larger, more decayed, and had an aura of malevolence that made my skin crawl. "We need to go around," Sarah whispered. But as we tried to skirt the ruins, we discovered that the forest had grown so thick on all sides that passage was impossible. The only way forward was straight through the center of the abandoned settlement. The buildings looked like they'd been deserted for decades, but as we passed the first structure, I noticed that some of the windows still held glass, and in one of them, I could swear I saw a pale face watching us before it disappeared. "Did you see?" I began. "Yes," Sarah cut me off. "Keep walking." The main building was larger than the others, with a sagging front porch and a door that hung open like a mouth. As we approached, that same discordant singing began again, echoing from somewhere inside. "It's coming from in there," Sarah said, and I realized with horror that her voice had taken on a dreamy, distant quality. "Sarah, no." But she was already walking toward the building, her movements puppet-like and wrong. I grabbed her arm and her skin felt ice-cold through her jacket. "Sarah." She blinked and looked at me as if seeing me for the first time. "Ken? What? Why are we here?" Before I could answer, the door of the building slammed shut with a bang that echoed through the clearing. Every window in every building suddenly blazed with that sickly light, and silhouettes began moving behind the glass. Too many figures for buildings that should have been empty. "Run," I whispered. We sprinted across the clearing, crashing through underbrush that tore at our clothes and skin. Behind us, I could hear doors opening, footsteps giving chase, not running, but walking with that same wrong rhythm I'd heard at our campsite. The forest on the far side of the clearing was different, older, darker, with trees so massive they seemed to predate human civilization. Their branches formed a canopy so thick that no moonlight penetrated, leaving us stumbling blind through a maze of roots and fallen logs. After what felt like hours, we collapsed beside a stream that glowed faintly with phosphorescence. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like jelly. Sarah was hyperventilating, her eyes wide with terror. "This can't be real," she gasped. "This has to be some kind of nightmare." I wanted to agree, but the scratches on my arms from the thorns were very real, as was the taste of copper in my mouth from where I'd bitten my tongue during our flight. "We need to find a way out of here," I said, trying to sound calmer than I felt. "In the morning, we'll be able to see." "There isn't going to be a morning," Sarah interrupted. "Look at the sky." I looked up through the gap in the canopy and felt my blood turn to ice. The stars were wrong. Not just their positions, but their colors, their number. The constellations I'd known since childhood were gone, replaced by patterns that hurt to look at directly. "That's impossible," I whispered. A splash in the stream made us both jump. Something large had disturbed the water upstream, but when I shined my phone's light in that direction, I saw only ripples that glowed eerily in the phosphorescent water. "Ken?" Sarah's voice was barely audible. "Something's in the water." The ripples were moving against the current, heading straight toward us. I grabbed Sarah's hand and we stumbled away from the stream, deeper into the impossible forest. That's when we heard the child crying. It was the sound of a young girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, sobbing with the kind of desperate anguish that would compel any decent person to investigate. The sound came from deeper in the woods, from a direction that felt somehow uphill despite the ground appearing level. "We have to help her," Sarah said, and again her voice had that dreamy quality. "No." I tightened my grip on her hand. "Nothing good lives in these woods. Whatever that is, it's not a child." But Sarah was stronger than she looked. She yanked free from my grasp and started walking toward the crying before I could stop her. "Sarah, don't—" The crying stopped instantly, replaced by a sound that froze my blood. Laughter. Not a child's laughter, but something ancient and malevolent, filled with such twisted joy that it made my teeth ache. Sarah stopped walking, her body going rigid. When she turned back to face me, her expression was completely blank. "Sarah?" "She wants to play," Sarah said in a voice not her own. Higher, younger, with an accent I couldn't place. "She's been so lonely here in the dark." I backed away as Sarah began walking toward me with that same puppet-like gait I'd seen earlier. Her eyes had gone completely black, reflecting nothing. "Sarah, fight it. Whatever's controlling you, fight it." "She doesn't want to fight," the thing wearing Sarah's face said. "She wants to stay and play with the others. They're all here, you know. All the missing hikers. They're so happy now." I turned and ran, hating myself for abandoning her, but knowing that whatever had taken control of Sarah was not my girlfriend anymore. Behind me, I could hear her pursuing, not running, but walking with that horrible wrong rhythm. The forest began to change around me as I fled. The trees became more twisted, their bark taking on an organic quality that reminded me uncomfortably of scarred flesh. The undergrowth grew sparse, replaced by patches of something that squelched wetly under my feet and gave off a smell like rotting meat. I burst through a line of trees and found myself in another clearing. But this one was different. In the center stood a circle of standing stones that definitely hadn't been marked on any map of Kentucky. They were covered in the same crude symbols I'd seen carved into the trees, but these were much older, worn smooth by centuries of weather. And arranged around the stones were sleeping bags. Dozens of them, all unzipped from the inside, all empty. My phone chose that moment to emit a shrill electronic shriek and die completely, plunging me into absolute darkness. "Found you," said Sarah's voice from directly behind me. I spun around, swinging wildly in the dark. My fist connected with something soft and cold that felt nothing like human flesh. The impact sent whatever it was staggering backward with a sound like tearing cloth. "That wasn't very nice," the thing said, and now its voice was changing, becoming something that no human throat could produce. Multiple tones layered on top of each other, harmonizing in impossible ways. I ran again, crashing blindly through the forest with branches whipping at my face and roots trying to trip me with every step. Behind me, that singing started up again. Not just the Sarah thing, but dozens of voices joining in from all directions. Time became meaningless. I might have been running for minutes or hours. The forest seemed to shift around me, paths appearing and disappearing, the ground level changing without warning. More than once I found myself running uphill only to realize I was somehow moving downhill instead. Eventually, exhaustion forced me to stop. I collapsed beside what felt like another stream, gasping for air that tasted of copper and decay. My clothes were torn to rags, and I could feel blood from countless scratches covering my arms and face. The singing had stopped, but I could sense things moving in the darkness around me. Patient, waiting. "Why are you running from us, Kenneth?" The voice came from across the stream. It sounded like Sarah, but not quite, as if someone was imitating her voice from memory and getting the details slightly wrong. "You wanted to get away from civilization," the voice continued. "You wanted to disconnect. Well, here you are, completely disconnected, forever." "What do you want?" I called back, surprised by how steady my own voice sounded. "Want?" The thing laughed, and the sound echoed strangely as if it was being reflected off surfaces that weren't there. We don't want anything, Kenneth. We just are. We've always been here, in the deep places, the forgotten places, and now that you've found us, you get to stay. Where's Sarah? The real Sarah? Oh, she's here. They're all here. Every hiker who's ever gotten lost in these woods, every spelunker who went too deep into the wrong cave, every coal miner who dug into something that should have stayed buried. They're all part of us now. I stood up slowly, trying to gauge the distance to the voice. If I could get across the stream— Don't, the Sarah thing said. There's nowhere to run, Kenneth. The forest goes on forever now. Every path leads back to us. To prove its point, I heard footsteps approaching from every direction. That same wrong rhythm, but multiplied dozens of times over. They were surrounding me. However, the voice continued, we're not unreasonable. We'll make you a deal. What kind of deal? Give us something precious, something you value more than your own life. Do that, and we'll let you go. You can walk right out of these woods and never look back. I thought of Sarah, the real Sarah, wherever she was. And if I refuse? Then you join our little community, forever. The footsteps were getting closer. In the faint starlight, I could begin to make out shapes moving between the trees, human-like figures that moved with that unsettling puppet gait. What do you want me to give you? Your memories of her, the thing said. Every moment you shared, every feeling, every dream of a future together. Give us all of that, and you can go. I closed my eyes, weighing the impossible choice. Live, but forget the woman I loved? Or die and join whatever hellish collective these things represented? How do I know you'll keep your word? You don't. But it's the only offer you're going to get. The figures were close enough now that I could see details that made my stomach lurch. They looked human at first glance, but wrong in subtle ways. Joints that bent too far, skin that had a waxy, artificial sheen, eyes that were solid black and reflected light like an animal's. And in the front of the group, I recognized Sarah. Or what had been Sarah. Decide, Kenneth, the thing wearing her face said. Now. I looked at the creature that had been the woman I loved, at the dozens of other lost souls surrounding me, and made my choice. No. The word hung in the air like a physical thing. The creatures stopped advancing, as if my refusal had created some kind of barrier. No? The Sarah thing tilted its head at an impossible angle. Are you sure? This is your last chance. I'm sure. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, dead but still solid. I'd rather die as myself than live as something less. That's when I noticed something the creatures had missed in their confidence. My phone's screen was cracked, but caught in one of the fractures was a shard of glass that reflected the starlight like a tiny mirror. I've always been good with details. It's what made me successful in accounting. And one detail I'd noticed during our flight through the forest was that none of these things cast reflections in the phosphorescent stream. All right then, the Sarah thing said, raising its two long arms. Welcome to— I smashed the phone against a rock, grabbed the largest shard of screen glass, and held it up like a shield. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The creatures recoiled as if I'd brandished a burning torch, their forms wavering and becoming indistinct. Clever, the Sarah thing hissed, but its voice was weaker now, less certain. But that won't last forever. It was right. The glass shard was small, and holding it was cutting my palm. But it gave me an idea. I'd noticed something else during our mad flight. We'd passed the same landmarks multiple times, but in different configurations. The forest wasn't just changing, it was folding in on itself, creating a kind of maze where the normal rules of geography didn't apply. But mazes have solutions, and every folding has a crease. Keeping the glass shard raised, I began walking in a very specific pattern, not trying to find a way out, but looking for the inconsistencies, the places where the fold didn't quite match up. You can't escape, the creatures called after me, but they didn't follow. The broken glass kept them at bay. It took hours, but eventually I found what I was looking for. a spot where two trees grew from the same root system but cast shadows in different directions. The fold was imperfect here, and if I was right about the geometry. I closed my eyes, stepped forward, and felt reality tear around me like paper. When I opened them, I was standing on the original Pine Mountain Trail, just as the sun was rising over the eastern ridges. My phone had full signal again. My GPS was working, and according to the timestamp, it was the same day we'd arrived, as if no time had passed at all. But my clothes were still torn, my body still covered in scratches, and my palm was still bleeding from the glass shard I no longer held. And Sarah was gone. Not just missing, gone as if she'd never existed. The ranger at the visitor center had no record of a Sarah Martinez. My phone contained no pictures of her, no text messages, no evidence that she'd ever been part of my life. But I remembered. Every moment, every laugh, every plan we'd made for the future. The creatures had tried to make me trade those memories for my freedom, but somehow I'd kept both. The official report listed me as suffering from exposure and possible head trauma that caused hallucinations. They found my campsite exactly where I'd left it, but with only one tent, one sleeping bag, one set of supplies. The other gear simply wasn't there. But sometimes, late at night, I get calls from a number I don't recognize. When I answer, I hear singing, that same discordant harmony from the deep woods. And sometimes, just before I hang up, I hear a voice that sounds almost like Sarah's. "Kenneth," it whispers, "come back to us. We're still here in the deep places. We're still waiting." I've moved 3 times since then, changed my number twice, but the calls always find me. Because you can't completely escape the deep places, can you? They're always there, just past the edge of civilization, waiting for people to get lost. And the worst part, sometimes, in my weakest moments, I'm tempted to go back. Because even if Sarah isn't really Sarah anymore, she's still there, still waiting. But I won't go. Because I know now that some things are worse than being alone. Some things are worse than losing the person you love. Some things are worse than death itself. I've never been camping since. I never will again. But every night, when I look out my apartment window at the distant tree line, I wonder how many other people are wandering lost in those deep places right now, and whether they'll be strong enough to find their way out with their souls intact. Most of them won't be. And somewhere in the pine-dark hollows of eastern Kentucky, the creatures that wear their faces are still singing, still waiting, still hungry. My name is Sarah Rodriguez, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Pine Mountain State Resort Park, deep in the Appalachian Mountains of southeastern Kentucky, where the old coal mining towns give way to endless forests and forgotten hollers. I should have trusted my instincts when the park ranger at the visitor center gave us that look, the one that said we were making a mistake. Marcus had insisted on the backcountry permits for the most isolated section of the park, where the old mining trails wind through terrain that maps can't quite capture accurately. "We need this," he'd said, squeezing my hand. "After everything with your mom's cancer, we need to disconnect." Marcus Thompson, my boyfriend of 3 years, was the kind of person who believed nature could heal anything. At 31, he'd dragged us through dozens of hiking trips, always pushing for more remote locations, more challenging terrain. This time, he'd brought along his coworker Jake Mitchell and Jake's girlfriend Amanda Wright, both in their late 20s and eager to prove they could handle whatever the Kentucky wilderness threw at them. The trouble started before we even reached our campsite. Our GPS died first, not the battery, but the unit itself. The screen flickered once, twice, then went completely black. Marcus laughed it off, pulling out his backup compass and the topographical maps he'd printed from the Park Service website. But when we spread them out at our first rest stop, the trail markers didn't match what we were seeing. "This switchback should be here," Marcus muttered, tapping the map with his finger. "But I swear we passed it 20 minutes ago." Jake wiped sweat from his forehead, leaving a grimy streak across his skin. Maybe we're moving faster than we thought. Amanda shifted her pack, wincing. Or slower. I feel like we've been walking uphill for hours. The trees pressed closer here, old-growth pines and oaks that blocked out most of the afternoon sun. The forest floor was carpeted with decades of fallen leaves that muffled our footsteps and seemed to absorb sound itself. Even our voices seemed smaller, swallowed by the oppressive canopy above. That's when I first noticed the smell. It was subtle at first, just a hint of something wrong beneath the expected scents of pine needles and rich earth. Something sweet and cloying, like fruit left to rot in the sun. I mentioned it to the others, but they couldn't smell anything unusual. "Probably just a dead deer somewhere," Marcus said dismissively. "Circle of life and all that." We pressed on, following what we hoped was the trail toward our designated campsite near Honeysuckle Branch. The deeper we went, the more the forest seemed to change around us. The trees grew taller, their trunks wider, their bark darker. The underbrush became thicker, more tangled, as if it were actively trying to bar our passage. By the time we reached what Marcus insisted was our campsite, though it looked nothing like the photos on the park website, the sun was already sinking toward the horizon. The clearing was smaller than expected, ringed by massive trees whose branches intertwined overhead like gnarled fingers. A small creek ran along one edge, its water so dark it looked black in the fading light. "This doesn't feel right," I said, dropping my pack with a thud that seemed to echo strangely in the confined space. "It's just because we're tired," Amanda said, but her voice lacked conviction. She kept glancing over her shoulder as if expecting something to emerge from the tree line. Jake was already unpacking his tent, trying to project confidence. "Come on, it's beautiful here. Look at those trees. Some of them have to be over 100 years old." That was true. The oaks and pines surrounding us were ancient, their trunks scarred with old injuries and strange growths that looked almost like faces in the dim light. I'd always found old forests peaceful, but this place felt different, watchful. We set up camp as the darkness settled around us like a heavy blanket. Marcus struggled with our tent. The stakes kept hitting rocks or roots, and the fabric seemed to catch on every protruding branch. Jake's portable camp stove wouldn't light properly, the flame sputtering and dying each time he tried to cook dinner. "Probably the altitude," Marcus said, though we couldn't be more than a few 100 feet higher than when we'd started. We ate cold sandwiches and trail mix by flashlight, our conversation growing more stilted as the night deepened. The forest around us was completely silent. No owls, no insects, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just an oppressive quiet that seemed to press against our eardrums. "Remember that time in college when we got lost in Mammoth Cave?" Jake said suddenly, his voice too loud in the stillness. "Spent 6 hours wandering in the dark before we found the main trail?" "That was different," Amanda replied. "We had guides then, rangers, people who knew where we were." I pulled my sleeping bag tighter around my shoulders. The temperature had dropped significantly since sunset, and despite being late September, the cold felt bone deep, as if it were seeping up from the earth itself. "We should have told someone our exact route," I said. The ranger at the visitor center seemed concerned about this section of the park. Marcus waved dismissively. He was just being cautious. Liability issues. Besides, we filed our backcountry permit. They know generally where we are. "Generally isn't specifically," Amanda muttered. That's when we heard the first sound. It started as a low humming, almost like singing, but not quite. The melody was wrong somehow. Too many notes that didn't belong together, rising and falling in patterns that hurt to listen to. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the trees in ways that made it impossible to pinpoint the source. "What the hell is that?" Jake whispered, his hand moving instinctively to the camping knife on his belt. The humming continued for several minutes, growing louder and more discordant before finally fading away. In the silence that followed, I realized I'd been holding my breath. "Probably just someone else camping nearby," Marcus said, but his voice shook slightly. Sound carries weird in the mountains. That didn't sound human, Amanda said what we were all thinking. We tried to sleep, but the humming returned twice more during the night, each time closer and more unsettling than before. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to Marcus's forced, even breathing beside me, knowing he was as awake as I was. Through the thin walls of our tent, I could hear Jake and Amanda whispering anxiously to each other. Morning brought little relief. I woke to find our campfire had gone out completely. Not just died down, but gone cold, as if it had never been lit. The ashes were scattered in a pattern that looked almost deliberate, spiraling outward from the fire ring in a way that made my skin crawl. Wind must have been stronger than we thought, Marcus said, but there was no conviction in his voice. Jake discovered that his pack had been moved during the night. He'd left it propped against a tree, but now it sat in the middle of the clearing, perfectly upright but facing the opposite direction. Nothing was missing, but everything inside had been carefully rearranged. Bears, Amanda suggested hopefully. Bears don't rearrange your underwear in alphabetical order, Jake replied, holding up his perfectly folded clothes. We packed quickly, eager to move on to our next planned campsite near the old mining ruins of Wasioto. But as we prepared to leave, Marcus realized his compass was spinning wildly, the needle unable to settle on magnetic north. "These mountains probably have iron deposits," he said, tapping the compass face. "Messes with magnetic instruments." I wanted to point out that iron deposits don't make compasses spin like tops, but I held my tongue. We had to keep moving. Staying here felt increasingly dangerous, though I couldn't articulate why. The trail, or what we hoped was the trail, led us deeper into the mountains. The forest grew denser, older, more alien with each mile. The trees were massive here, their trunks twisted into shapes that seemed almost intentional. Branches reached across the path like grasping arms, forcing us to duck and weave constantly. The smell I'd noticed the day before was stronger now, that sickly sweet odor of decay that seemed to follow us no matter which direction the wind blew. Sometimes it was so strong it made me gag, but the others still claimed they couldn't smell anything unusual. Around midday, we stopped for lunch at what appeared to be an old mining camp. Rusted machinery sat scattered among the trees like the bones of some ancient creature, and the remains of wooden structures were slowly being reclaimed by the forest. A sign, barely legible through decades of weather damage, read, "Harlan County Mining So, EST, 1923. "This place isn't on our map," Amanda said, consulting the topographical sheets that had become increasingly useless. "Lots of old mining operations in these mountains," Marcus replied. "Most of them were abandoned when the coal played out." Jake was exploring the ruins, his footsteps echoing strangely off the rusted metal. "Hey, look at this," he called out. "There's still stuff here." He'd found what looked like a camp inside one of the partially collapsed buildings. A sleeping bag, cooking equipment, personal items, all arranged as if someone had just stepped away for a moment. But everything was covered in a fine layer of dust that suggested no one had been here for months. "We should go," I said, my unease growing stronger. "This feels like trespassing." "Relax," Marcus said. "Whoever was camping here is long gone." But as we were preparing to leave, Jake made a discovery that changed everything. In the back of the ruined building, hidden behind a pile of rotting timber, he found a journal. The cover was water-stained and partially decomposed, but the pages inside were still readable. Jake flipped through it quickly, his expression growing more troubled with each page. "Listen to this," he said, finding an entry near the end. Day 12. The sounds are getting worse. Thomas went to gather firewood this morning and came back different. He's been sitting by the fire for 6 hours now, just staring. Won't respond when I call his name. His eyes. There's something wrong with his eyes. Amanda had gone very pale. "What's the date on that entry?" Jake checked the top of the page. "September 15th, this year." That was 8 days ago. "We need to leave," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "Right now." "Wait," Marcus said, taking the journal from Jake. "There might be information about the trails, about how to get out of here." He flipped through more pages, reading selected passages aloud. Day 8. Maps are useless here. GPS died on day 3. Compass spins like a carnival ride. We're walking in circles, but the landmarks keep changing. Day 10. Found Sarah's backpack this morning, but Sarah's been dead for 3 days. I watched Thomas bury her after the thing wearing Billy's face killed her, but her pack was sitting by our fire this morning, perfectly clean, like it had just been unpacked. My blood ran cold when I heard my own name, even though I knew it had to be coincidence. Day 11. Thomas tried to kill me last night. I woke up to find him standing over me with the camp axe. But when I looked into his eyes, I could see Thomas in there, trapped, screaming. Something else is wearing him like a coat. Marcus's voice had grown steadily more strained as he read. Now he stopped completely, staring at something on the final page. "What is it?" Amanda asked. Marcus held up the journal so we could see. The last entry was written in a different handwriting. Neater, more controlled. Day 13. I am Thomas. I am not Thomas. The man who wrote in this book is gone, but I remember his memories like dreams. Soon there will be others. The forest is hungry, and we are what it eats. Below that, in the same neat handwriting, they will come in groups of 4. 2 men, 2 women. They will camp by Honeysuckle Branch first, then visit this place. When they read this, it will already be too late. I felt the world tilt sideways. We were a group of 4. 2 men, 2 women. We had camped by Honeysuckle Branch. And now we were here, reading these words. "This is someone's idea of a sick joke," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. Jake was backing toward the entrance of the ruined building, his face white as paper. "We need to get out of here. Now." That's when Amanda screamed. She was pointing at something behind us, at the edge of the clearing. A man stood there, perfectly still, watching us. He was tall and thin, wearing hiking clothes that looked expensive but were covered in mud and what looked like dried blood. His face was ordinary, the kind of face you'd forget the moment you looked away, except for his eyes. His eyes were completely black. "Hello," he said, and his voice was perfectly normal, perfectly friendly. "I'm Thomas. Are you lost?" None of us moved. The man who called himself Thomas smiled, but the expression never reached those black, empty eyes. "I know these mountains very well," he continued. "I can help you find your way." "We're fine," Marcus said, his voice tight with fear. "Thanks anyway." Thomas's smile widened. "Oh, but you're not fine. You're very lost. Your maps don't work here. Your compass spins. Your phones have no signal. You've been walking in circles for 2 days." It was true, all of it. "How do you know that?" Amanda whispered. "Because this is my home now," Thomas replied. "I've been waiting for you. All of you." He took a step forward and I noticed that his feet made no sound on the leaf-covered ground. No sound at all. "The forest is hungry," he said, still smiling that horrible empty smile. "And you're what it wants to eat." Jake lunged for his pack, grabbing the camping knife from his belt. "Stay back!" Thomas laughed, a sound like wind through dead leaves. "That won't help you. Nothing will help you. But don't worry, it doesn't hurt for long, and afterward you'll understand. You'll see why this is better." I grabbed Marcus's arm. "Run!" We ran. Behind us, Thomas's laughter followed, seeming to come from every direction at once. The forest that had seemed dense before now felt actively malevolent. Branches catching at our clothes and hair, roots reaching up to trip us, the very ground seeming to shift beneath our feet. We stumbled through the undergrowth for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, our packs bouncing painfully against our backs, our breathing harsh and ragged in the oppressive silence. When we finally stopped, we found ourselves in another clearing, this one smaller and darker than the mining camp. "Where are we?" Amanda gasped, looking around wildly. Jake consulted his compass. swearing when he saw the needles spinning uselessly. "I don't know. Nothing looks familiar." "We need to find the main trail," Marcus said, but his voice shook. "Get back to civilization." I was studying the trees around us, trying to get my bearings, when I noticed something that made my blood freeze. Carved into the bark of the largest oak, barely visible in the fading light, were words. "Sarah was here." "Did you carve that?" Marcus asked, following my gaze. I shook my head. "I've never been here before in my life." But even as I said it, I felt a strange sense of familiarity, as if I had been here before, in dreams or in another life. Jake found more carvings on other trees. Amanda will stay. Marcus belongs here. Jake is home. "This is impossible," Amanda said, her voice rising toward hysteria. "Someone's playing games with us." "The journal said they would come in groups of 4, I said, the pieces clicking together in my mind. 2 men, 2 women, it knew our names. "Coincidence," Marcus insisted, but he was backing toward the center of the clearing, away from the carved trees. That's when Jake disappeared. One moment he was standing next to a carved oak, running his fingers over the letters of his name. The next moment, he was gone. Not walked away, not moved deeper into the forest. Simply gone, as if the earth had swallowed him whole. "Jake!" Amanda screamed, spinning in circles. "Jake, where are you?" We searched frantically, calling his name, but there was no response, no trace of him anywhere. His pack lay on the ground where he'd been standing, but Jake himself had vanished completely. "We have to find him," Amanda said, tears streaming down her face. "We can't leave him." "He'll be back," said a familiar voice from the edge of the clearing. Thomas stood there again, still smiling that empty smile. But now there was something different about him, something that made him look less solid, less real. "He went to gather firewood," Thomas continued. "He'll be back soon, won't you, Jake?" From somewhere in the darkness beyond the trees came Jake's voice. "I'm fine, just gathering firewood. I'll be back soon." But the voice was wrong, too flat, too emotionless, like someone reading from a script. "That's not Jake," I whispered. "Of course it's Jake," Thomas said. "Who else would it be?" Jake emerged from the forest carrying an armload of dead branches. He walked directly to the center of the clearing and began arranging them in a neat pile, his movements mechanical and precise. When he was finished, he sat down next to the unlit wood and stared straight ahead, unblinking. "Jake?" Amanda approached him cautiously. "Are you okay?" He turned to look at her, and I saw what the journal had meant about the eyes. Jake's eyes were completely black now, just like Thomas's. But there was something else, a flicker of the real Jake trapped behind that darkness, his face twisted in silent agony. "I'm fine," he said in that same flat voice. "Just tired. We should make camp here." "No," I said, grabbing Marcus and Amanda. "We're leaving, now." But when we turned to go, Thomas was blocking our path. "You can't leave," he said reasonably. "This is your home now. The forest has chosen you." "We're not staying," Marcus said, trying to sound braver than he felt. Thomas tilted his head, considering. "You don't understand. The forest is alive here. Aware. It's been waiting so long for new friends. It gets lonely, you see. The old mining camps, the abandoned towns, they're full of bones. But bones don't make good company." He gestured toward Jake, who continued to stare straight ahead with those horrible black eyes. "Jake understands now. Soon you will too." I felt a scream building in my throat, but before I could make a sound, the world around us began to change. The trees moved closer without appearing to move. The clearing shrank. The sky overhead darkened even though it was still afternoon. The very air grew thick and viscous like breathing syrup. "The forest doesn't like it when people leave," Thomas explained conversationally. "It takes it personally, so it makes sure they stay. Forever." That's when Amanda broke. She'd been standing perfectly still since Jake returned, staring at him with growing horror. Now she suddenly lunged forward, grabbing a heavy branch from the pile Jake had collected. "Give him back!" she screamed, swinging the branch at Thomas's head. The wood passed right through him as if he were made of smoke. Thomas laughed. "Silly Amanda. You can't hurt something that's already dead." Amanda's attack seemed to break whatever spell was holding the forest in check. The trees began moving visibly now, their roots erupting from the ground like grasping fingers, their branches reaching down to grab at us. The ground beneath our feet became soft and boggy, threatening to swallow us with each step. I grabbed Marcus's hand and pulled him toward what I hoped was still a gap between the trees. "We have to go!" But as we ran, I could hear Amanda screaming behind us, and when I looked back I saw her sinking into the earth itself, the ground pulling her down like quicksand. "Help me!" she cried, reaching desperately toward us. Marcus started to turn back, but I held him tight. "It's too late," I said, hating myself even as I said it. "We can't save her." Thomas was standing over Amanda now, his face a mask of false sympathy. "Don't fight it," he told her gently. "It's easier if you don't fight it." Amanda's screams cut off abruptly as the earth closed over her head. Marcus and I ran blindly through the transforming forest, branches whipping at our faces, roots trying to trip us with every step. Behind us, I could hear Thomas calling out in that same friendly voice, "You can't run forever, Sarah. The forest is everywhere, and it knows your name." We stumbled through the darkness for hours or maybe minutes. Time seemed fluid here, unreliable. Eventually, we found ourselves back at the old mining camp, though it looked different now, newer. As if the decades of decay had been reversed, the rusted machinery gleaming, the wooden structures whole and strong. "This isn't right," Marcus panted, leaning against what had been a collapsed wall but was now a solid wooden beam. This place was in ruins. I was studying the restored camp when I noticed the sounds, the distant clang of metal on metal, voices calling to each other, the general noise of men at work. But when I looked around, I saw no one. "Ghost sounds," I whispered. "The forest is showing us the past." That's when I saw the sign, freshly painted and perfectly legible. Harlan County, Mining Code EST 1923. Foreman, Thomas Clayton. Thomas Clayton. Not just Thomas. Thomas Clayton, the foreman of this mining operation a century ago. "He's been here all along," I said, understanding flooding through me. "He died here, and the forest kept him, just like it's keeping Jake and Amanda." Marcus was staring at the restored buildings with growing horror. "How long have people been disappearing here?" "Since the mine opened, probably. Maybe longer." That's when we heard footsteps approaching through the darkness. Slow, measured, deliberate. Thomas appeared at the edge of the restored camp, but now he was wearing the clothes of a 1920s mining foreman. Suspenders, work shirt, heavy boots. His face was clearer now, more solid, as if being in his original time period had strengthened him. "Welcome home," he said, spreading his arms wide. "I've been waiting for you to come back." "We were never here before," Marcus said. Thomas smiled. "Of course you were. You're Sarah Rodriguez and Marcus Thompson. You've been here many times. You just forgot." He was right, I realized with growing dread. We had been here before, in the journal entries, in the carved names on the trees, in the forest's hungry memory. Every group of hikers who disappeared became part of its history, their names and faces and stories absorbed into the eternal present of this place. "The forest remembers everything," Thomas continued. "Every person who ever walked these trails, every life it ever claimed. You're all here, all of you, living the same moments over and over again, the same fear, the same hope, the same despair." He gestured toward the restored mining camp. "This is how it was when I first came here, 100 years ago, and this is how it will always be for all of us." I felt the truth of it settling into my bones like cold poison. We had been here before. We would be here again. The forest was a loop, a trap, a hungry mouth that swallowed people and their stories and made them eternal. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm me, I noticed something Thomas didn't seem to realize. The restored camp wasn't perfect. There were inconsistencies, modern equipment mixed in with the 1920s machinery, clothing from different eras scattered around the buildings, anachronisms that suggested the forest's memory wasn't as reliable as it claimed. "You're not as powerful as you think," I said suddenly. Thomas's smile faltered for the first time. "What do you mean?" "The forest remembers, but it doesn't remember perfectly. It mixes things up, gets confused. That's why Jake came back wrong. It doesn't know how to copy people exactly." I was thinking out loud now, desperation making me bold. "And if it makes mistakes—" Thomas's face darkened. "Clever Sarah. Too clever. The forest doesn't like clever people." The ground beneath us began to shift again. But this time, I was ready. I grabbed Marcus and pulled him toward one of the restored buildings, a small wooden structure that had been completely collapsed when we'd first seen it, but now stood whole and strong. "If this place exists in multiple time periods simultaneously," I said, pushing Marcus inside, "then maybe we can find a way out that exists in multiple time periods too." The building was bigger inside than it should have been, its walls stretching back into darkness that seemed to go on forever. Tools hung from the walls, some modern, some ancient, some that looked like they belonged to no recognizable time period at all. "Sarah," Marcus whispered, "what are you looking for?" "The mine shaft," I said. "If this was a mining operation, there has to be a way down into the mountain, and if the forest's memory is confused—" I found what I was looking for in the back of the building, a wooden trapdoor set into the floor, modern hinges on century-old wood. When I pulled it open, cold air rushed up from below, carrying the scent of deep earth and running water. "The mine goes down to the water table," I said. "If we can follow the underground stream, it might lead us out of the forest's influence." "Or it might lead us deeper into its trap," Marcus said. Behind us, Thomas's voice was getting closer. "Sarah, Marcus, you can't hide from the forest. It sees everything. It knows everything." I looked down into the dark shaft, then back at Marcus. "We have to try. It's better than staying here forever." Marcus nodded grimly. "Together. Together." We lowered ourselves into the shaft, our feet finding purchase on rotting wooden rungs that might have been installed last week or a century ago. The darkness closed over us like water, and Thomas's voice faded to a distant echo. The mine shaft was deeper than I'd expected, and by the time we reached the bottom, my arms were shaking from the strain. We found ourselves in a narrow tunnel carved from living rock, water running along one side in a channel that looked both natural and artificial. "This way," I said, choosing the direction where the water flow seemed strongest. We followed the stream through the mountain's heart, our flashlights creating wild shadows on the tunnel walls. The air was cold and wet, but it smelled clean, no trace of that sickly sweet decay that had followed us through the forest above. For the first time in days, I began to hope. The tunnel branched and split, joining other waterways in an underground network that must have extended for miles. We kept following the main flow, reasoning that all water eventually leads to larger bodies of water, and larger bodies of water meant civilization. "How long have we been walking?" Marcus asked after what felt like hours. I checked my watch and was startled to see it was working again, showing a reasonable time. "Maybe 2 hours?" "My phone has signal," Marcus said suddenly, holding up his device. "1 bar, but it's something." We tried calling for help, but the calls wouldn't go through. Still, the fact that our technology was working again suggested we were moving beyond the forest's influence. The tunnel opened suddenly into a larger cavern, and we found ourselves standing on the shore of an underground lake. The water was perfectly black and perfectly still, reflecting our flashlight beams like a mirror. "There," Marcus said, pointing across the water. "Is that light?" On the far shore, barely visible in the distance, was what looked like artificial light. Electric light, not the organic phosphorescence of cave formations. "How do we get across?" I asked. That's when we found the boat. It was tied to a small wooden dock that definitely hadn't been there a moment before, but I was beyond questioning the forest's strange logic. The boat was old but solid, with 2 sets of oars and what looked like recent maintenance. "I don't like this," Marcus said. "It's too convenient." "Everything here is too convenient," I replied. "That's how this place works, but maybe we can use that against it." We climbed into the boat and began rowing toward the distant light. The water was so still it barely rippled around the oars, and our progress seemed unnaturally fast, as if some current was helping push us along. Halfway across the lake, I realized what the light was. It was a campfire, and sitting around that campfire were 4 familiar figures: Jake and Amanda looking exactly as they had before everything went wrong, and 2 other people I didn't recognize but who seemed somehow familiar. "It's a trap," Marcus said, but even as he spoke I could see the desperate hope in his eyes. "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe this is how the forest works. Maybe everyone who gets trapped here exists simultaneously, in all possible states." We reached the far shore and pulled the boat up onto a rocky beach. The campfire was in a small clearing just beyond the water's edge, and as we approached, Jake looked up and waved. "Sarah, Marcus, there you are. We were starting to worry." He looked perfectly normal. No black eyes, no mechanical movements, just Jake as he'd always been. "Where have you been?" Amanda asked. "You disappeared for hours." The 2 strangers introduced themselves as Thomas and Sarah. Not the demonic Thomas from the forest, but a young couple from Ohio who'd gotten lost while hiking. They seemed genuinely friendly, genuinely concerned about our welfare. "This is wrong," I whispered to Marcus. "This isn't real." But Marcus was already sitting down by the fire, accepting a cup of coffee from Jake. The warmth and normalcy of the scene was seductive after the horrors we'd experienced. "Maybe it doesn't matter if it's real," he said quietly. "Maybe this is as close to escape as we're going to get." I wanted to argue, but I was so tired. Tired of running, tired of being afraid, tired of fighting against forces I couldn't understand. The fire was warm, the company was friendly, and for the first time in what felt like days, I felt safe. I sat down next to Marcus and accepted my own cup of coffee. It tasted exactly right. Not the bitter brew of camping coffee, but the perfect cup, exactly as I liked it. "So, what's the plan for tomorrow?" Jake asked. "I was thinking we could explore those old mining ruins. I heard there's some interesting history there." "Sounds good," I heard myself saying, even though every instinct screamed that this was wrong. The other Thomas, the friendly one, was telling stories about his hiking adventures, and his voice was warm and engaging. Nothing like the cold, empty voice of the Thomas we'd encountered in the forest. This Thomas was real, human, alive. But as the night wore on, I began to notice small inconsistencies. Jake mentioned events that hadn't happened yet. Amanda talked about places we hadn't been. The friendly Thomas sometimes forgot what he'd said minutes before, repeating stories with slight variations. And all of them, without exception, kept suggesting we visit the old mining ruins. "We should really explore that camp," Amanda said for the 3rd time. "I bet there's some fascinating history there." "Absolutely," Jake agreed. "We could make a whole day of it." I caught Marcus's eye across the fire. He'd noticed the repetitions too, the way the conversation kept circling back to the same topics, the same suggestions. "I think I'll turn in," I said, standing up. "Long day tomorrow." "Good idea," the friendly Thomas said. "You'll want to be rested for the mining camp." Marcus and I retreated to our tent. Somehow our campsite was exactly as we'd left it, complete with all our gear. But once we were alone, Marcus grabbed my arm. "This isn't escape," he whispered. "This is just another layer of the trap." I nodded. "The forest is giving us what we want most. Our friends back, everything normal. but it's not real. So, what do we do? I thought about the journal we'd found, about the pattern of groups disappearing, about the way the forest seemed to feed on hope and despair equally. We have to reject it, I said. We have to choose to leave, even if staying feels safer. It was the hardest decision I'd ever made. Outside our tent, I could hear Jake and Amanda laughing around the campfire, planning tomorrow's adventure. It would be so easy to stay, to pretend this was real, to live in this comfortable illusion forever. But that wasn't living at all. On 3? Marcus asked. On 3. We packed quickly and quietly, then slipped out of our tent and away from the false campfire. Behind us, I could hear the friendly Thomas calling, "Where are you going? Come back, it's dangerous out there." We ran into the darkness beyond the fire's glow, leaving the illusion of safety behind. The underground cavern stretched ahead of us, lit only by our flashlights, but I could see another light in the distance. Not the warm glow of a campfire, but the cold, clean light of electric bulbs. We ran toward that light, and as we did, the illusion behind us began to break down. Jake's friendly laughter became Thomas's cold chuckling. Amanda's concerned voice became something hungry and inhuman. The warm campfire became the phosphorescent glow of decay. The light ahead grew brighter, and suddenly we were stumbling out of a cave entrance and into brilliant daylight. Real daylight, with real sun and real sky and the real sounds of civilization in the distance. We'd emerged on the side of a mountain I didn't recognize, but far below I could see a road. A real road with real cars. We scrambled down the slope, ignoring the cuts from rocks and branches, focused only on reaching that beautiful strip of asphalt. When we finally reached the road, gasping and exhausted, a park ranger's truck pulled up beside us. The ranger, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a genuine smile, looked at us with concern. "You folks okay? You look like you've been through hell." "We got lost," Marcus said, and it was both the truth and a massive understatement. The ranger helped us into her truck and drove us back to the Pine Mountain Visitor Center. As we rode, she explained that we'd emerged from a cave system nearly 15 miles from where we'd entered the forest. A cave system that, according to her maps, didn't exist. "Happens sometimes in these mountains," she said with a shrug. "Old mine shafts, natural caves, they connect in ways we don't fully understand. Lucky you found your way out." At the visitor center, we filed a report about Jake and Amanda. I watched the ranger's face grow troubled as we described their disappearance, but I could see she didn't entirely believe our story. How could she? We barely believed it ourselves. "We'll organize a search party," she promised. "But these mountains, sometimes people who get lost stay lost." 3 months later, I received a package in the mail. No return address, postmarked from Harlan County, Kentucky. Inside was a journal, not the one we'd found in the mining camp, but a new one. The first entry was written in Jake's handwriting. Day 1. My name is Jake Mitchell and I'm 29 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Pine Mountain State Resort Park. We came here as a group of 4, 2 men, 2 women. Now there are only 3 of us left, but Sarah will be back soon. She went to gather firewood this morning. The second entry was in Amanda's handwriting. Day 2. Jake is acting strange. He keeps insisting Sarah is coming back, but I saw her fall into the earth 3 days ago. I think something is wearing Jake's face. There were dozens more entries, all in different handwriting, telling variations of the same story. Groups of hikers getting lost, encountering Thomas, losing members one by one. Some entries were dated from decades ago, others from just weeks before. The final entry was in my own handwriting, though I had never written it. Day unknown. My name is Sarah Rodriguez, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness of Pine Mountain State Resort Park. I thought I escaped, but the forest remembers everything. I'm writing this from my apartment in Louisville, but I can smell pine needles and decay. The forest is patient. It will wait for me to come back. I burned the journal that same night, but it didn't matter. The next morning, I found another one on my doorstep. Marcus and I tried to move on with our lives. We moved to a different state, changed jobs, even broke up for a while because being together reminded us too much of what we'd experienced. But the journals kept coming. Sometimes they contained new stories, new victims. Sometimes they repeated old ones. Always, they ended with the same message. The forest remembers, and it's waiting. 6 months after our escape, Marcus disappeared. He left no note, no explanation. His car was found abandoned at a trailhead in Pine Mountain State Resort Park. The search teams found no trace of him beyond that point, but I knew where he'd gone. The forest had called him back. That was 2 weeks ago. This morning, I woke up with pine needles in my hair and mud on my feet, though I went to sleep in my locked apartment in Cincinnati. I found a new journal on my kitchen table, open to a fresh page. At the top, in my own handwriting, were the words, Day 1. I can feel it now, the pull of those mountains growing stronger with each passing hour. The forest is patient, but it's also insistent. It wants its story to be complete, and I'm the missing piece. I know I should resist. I know I should stay away from Kentucky, away from those hungry mountains and their ancient, terrible memory. But I also know it won't matter. The forest will wait, and eventually I'll go back. We always go back. Maybe this time will be different. Maybe this time I'll find a way to break the cycle, to free the others, to silence the forest's hungry song forever. Or maybe I'll just become another entry in another journal, another voice calling lost hikers deeper into the woods. I'm writing this down as a warning, though I doubt anyone will believe it. If you're planning to hike in the remote areas of Pine Mountain State Resort Park, don't. Find somewhere else to commune with nature. Those mountains have too much memory, too much hunger. And if you do go, despite my warning, and you find yourself lost among ancient trees with a compass that spins and maps that lie, remember this. Don't trust the friendly voices that offer to help. Don't believe the familiar faces that emerge from the darkness. And whatever you do, don't read the journals you find in abandoned camps. The forest remembers everything, but some memories are better left forgotten. I can smell pine needles now, growing stronger despite the fact that I'm hundreds of miles from the nearest pine tree. My car keys are in my hand, though I don't remember picking them up. The forest is calling, and I think it's time to go home.